Picture this. It's the early 19th century. Dinner is served fashionably late, sometimes not until 8 or 9 at night. Lunch exists, but it's more like a polite nod to food than an actual meal. A roll here, maybe a bit of cheese there. That means by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the wealthy are absolutely famished. Enter Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, who in the 1840s committed one of the greatest culinary crimes against boredom. She invented afternoon tea. Well, invented in the sense that she demanded bread, butter, cake and a pot of tea to tide her over until dinner, and then, because she was a duchess, other people decided it was suddenly fashionable too. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Now, what started as one woman's attempt to avoid grumbling stomachs during polite conversation blossomed into a Victorian institution, and by the time we roll into the Edwardian era, 1901 to 1910, plus a few cultural aftershocks, tea wasn't just a snack, it was practically a performance art. The Edwardians inherited the Victorian ritual and turned it into a spectacle, elevating tea from Duchess's parlour hobby to an obsession that defined class, leisure, and an alarming devotion to tiny sandwiches. But let's rewind and appreciate how this ritual got there. In the 17th and 18th centuries, tea itself was still something of a novelty in England. The first shipments came from China in the mid-1600s, and the aristocracy quickly latched onto it as the chic new habit, right up there with powdered wigs and spending too much money on wallpaper. By the 18th century, tea had filtered down into middle-class homes. Though the leaves were so expensive, people sometimes locked them away in special caddies, because nothing says domestic harmony like accusing your spouse of stealing Darjeeling. Yet the actual ritual of afternoon tea didn't exist until the 19th century. It took the perfect storm, a duchess with hunger pangs, a society that adored showing off silver teapots, and the cultural obsession with manners. Queen Victoria, ever the trendsetter, adored tea herself, which gave the ritual an added royal endorsement. Once the monarch sips, the nation follows. Fast forward to the Edwardians, and you see the transition from a quaint Victorian pastime into a social mania. Why? Because Edwardian society was all about leisure and display. People had money, or wanted to look like they did, and afternoon tea was the perfect excuse to spend hours in public pretending to eat daintily while actually devouring cakes like they were going out of fashion. If Victorian tea was about propriety, Edwardian tea was about spectacle. Hotels created lavish tea rooms. Department stores opened salons where women could drink tea unchaperoned. Scandalous but thrilling, and it became a daily ritual not just for nobility, but also for the growing middle class, who wanted a slice of elegance with their scone. The Edwardian shift was also about timing. By 1905, industrialisation had completely altered daily schedules. For workers in offices or shops, afternoon tea was the cultural punctuation mark in an otherwise grinding day. For the wealthy, it was a glittering pause between horseback riding in the morning and an evening of dinners and theatre. It became the glue holding society together, and it came with rules. Oh, the rules. You couldn't just drink tea. You had to host it with the right china, the right posture, and ideally the right level of disdain for anyone who dared use a mug instead of a porcelain cup. And let's not forget that tea was more than just leaves steeped in hot water. It was a symbol of empire. By the Edwardian period, Britain had cornered the market on tea production in India and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, ensuring that the nation's favourite drink was also a daily reminder of colonial power. Nothing like dunking a biscuit while sipping on imperialism. This obsession wasn't just about food either. Afternoon tea became shorthand for Edwardian identity. Writers and satirists mocked it, cartoonists illustrated it, and politicians occasionally even leveraged it. If you wanted to lampoon the upper classes, you drew them sitting around sipping tea while Rome, or at least the coal mines of Yorkshire, metaphorically burned. So to sum up, tea started as an emergency snack for a hungry duchess, blossomed into a Victorian social ritual endorsed by queens, and exploded into Edwardian mania where no self-respecting society hostess would dare forgo the daily ceremony. Tea wasn't just a drink, it was a lifestyle choice with biscuits, a social performance with pastry props, and the Edwardian glue that held polite society together. preferably without spilling cream on the lace tablecloth. The good news? Afternoon tea gave people a reason to smile at 4 p.m. The bad news? If you forgot to invite the right people, you might as well pour the tea straight onto your reputation, because it was over. If the Victorian era built the stage, the Edwardians furnished it with velvet curtains, gilt chairs, and enough silverware to outfit a small army. The Edwardian period, running roughly from 1901 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, was an age where Britain liked to show off, and boy did they ever. This wasn't just about building empires overseas, it was about building social empires at home, with afternoon tea as the crown jewel. To understand why tea became such an irresistible obsession, you have to picture Edwardian Britain itself. This was a society swimming in contrasts. Fortunes built on coal, steel, and empire sat alongside streets of grinding poverty. Yet in the popular imagination, and in the glossy magazines of the day, the Edwardian era was a golden world of leisure. The wealthy classes had more free time than ever, and leisure was the new currency of status. Forget how much money you made. The real brag was how much time you wasted drinking tea while discussing whether Lady So-and-so's pearls were real. The upper classes lived in a haze of rituals, and each hour of the day was scheduled like a Broadway production. Breakfast at 9, riding or hunting at 11, luncheon at 1, and then the all-important tea at 4. Dinner was late, dances were later, and sleep was an optional accessory. Afternoon tea slotted into this schedule like the perfect middle act, a refined pause that showed you had both the wealth and the leisure to stop and sip. After all, if you were working in a factory 12 hours a day, the only tea break you knew was pouring hot water over tired bones and hoping you didn't fall asleep in your soup. For the wealthy, afternoon tea was more than refreshment. It was a status announcement. Every porcelain cup, every silver spoon, every sponge cake was a declaration that you belonged to the Edwardian elite. The stage wasn't just the tea table, it was Edwardian society itself, and the performance required props. Newspapers of the day were filled with advertisements for fine teas, gilt-edged cups, and elaborate tea services. Entire industries thrived on feeding the obsession, because nothing said "I've made it" quite like buying a new set of bone china, just so your cousin could gossip about her bridge club while dunking a shortbread biscuit. But here's the twist. Afternoon tea wasn't only for the aristocrats. The Edwardian period was marked by the rise of the middle class, that ambitious group of clerks, shopkeepers and professionals who wanted desperately to mimic the gentry. They couldn't buy titles, but they could buy tea sets. Afternoon tea became their ticket into the performance of respectability. Hosting tea meant you were civilized, genteel, and probably not going to stab your neighbour over a loaf of bread. For the middle classes, tea was an equalizer, a way of playing the same game as the aristocrats, even if their tea gowns were last season's and their sandwiches had more butter than caviar. This social obsession was also fueled by the rise of public spaces designed for tea drinking. Department stores, hotels, and tea rooms flourished, offering the perfect backdrop for genteel society. For women especially, this was revolutionary. Tea rooms were some of the first public places where women could meet unchaperoned. No stern uncle hovering in the corner, no suspicious glances from passers-by, just lace tablecloths, teapots, and the intoxicating thrill of freedom. Suffragettes may have been demanding the vote, but sometimes a cucumber sandwich in a public tea room felt just as radical. And while we're on the subject of spectacle, let's not forget that Edwardian Britain adored gossip. The nation practically ran on whispered secrets. Afternoon tea provided the perfect setting for this, a genteel excuse to lean over your cup and murmur about who was seen with whom at last night's ball. Think of it as the Edwardian version of Twitter. Quick, cutting updates, limited to 140 words, preferably delivered with a raised eyebrow. When you don't have Wi-Fi, you gossip over scones. Another reason tea thrived was the Edwardian love affair with appearances. This was the era of the grand country house weekend, the endless parade of balls, and the obsession with looking elegant even while standing still. Afternoon tea was a ritual that demanded visibility. One simply had to be seen at tea. If you weren't sipping at the Ritz or perched in Harrods tea room, did you even exist? In a society where social standing was as fragile as a porcelain cup, tea became a daily audition. The Edwardian stage wasn't all glamour, of course. It was underpinned by industrial wealth and colonial exploitation. While high society nibbled on eclairs, the reality was that their comfort was funded by the labour of others, miners in Wales, factory workers in Manchester, and tea pickers in India and Ceylon, the performance of afternoon tea hid this harsh backdrop, wrapping the empire's grit in a sugar-dusted veil of refinement. But to Edwardians, this was precisely the point. Tea was not about reality, it was about escaping it, one carefully stirred cup at a time. So the Edwardian social stage was perfectly primed for afternoon tea, a culture obsessed with leisure, an expanding middle class hungry for respectability, women carving out public spaces of their own, and a national addiction to gossip, all converged to make tea the ultimate social act. It wasn't just about hunger or thirst, it was about belonging, displaying and performing in the great theatre of Edwardian life. And like any great show, it always ended with applause, though in this case it sounded suspiciously like teaspoons clinking against porcelain. Of all the things the Edwardians obsessed over, hats, horses, house parties, timing was king. Afternoon tea was not just about what you ate or who you drank it with, but when. 4 o'clock wasn't an accident, nor was it negotiable. It was the sacred pause between lunch and dinner, a ritualized solution to a very real problem, hunger. The polite, dainty, socially acceptable kind of hunger, of course, not the sort you satisfy with a midnight raid on the pantry. Edwardian daily life, particularly for the wealthy, was structured like a stage play with acts, intermissions and climaxes. Breakfast happened leisurely, often later than we might imagine. 9 o'clock was common for the upper classes, sometimes even later if last night's dancing had gone on until dawn. Lunch came in the early afternoon, usually around 1 o'clock, though it was a far lighter affair than the Victorian luncheon. By the Edwardian period, luncheon was pared down to something simple: salads, cold meats, a soup, perhaps a tart. Nice, but hardly the fuel to keep one upright through fox hunting, shopping or gossiping about the neighbour's love life. Dinner was the real feast, the star of the show, and it arrived late, often 8 or 9 o'clock in fashionable households. That left a gaping void, a culinary canyon stretching from 1 o'clock until 9. That's 8 long hours of emptiness, in a society where fainting dramatically was a legitimate social risk. The Edwardians may have lived in opulence, but biology doesn't lie. Even a duchess gets peckish by mid-afternoon. Enter the magic hour, 4 o'clock tea. 4 p.m. became the sweet spot. Too early, and it encroached on luncheon. Too late, and it spoiled dinner. 4 was the golden hour of temptation, when the stomach began growling and social obligations began piling up. In essence, it was a synchronized national snack break, except instead of a granola bar at your desk, you had porcelain cups, silver trays and a pyramid of pastries. Basically, a socially acceptable excuse to eat cake before dinner. The ritual of 4 o'clock also tapped into the Edwardian obsession with rhythm and order. Everything in their world ran on schedules. The trains, the post, the dances, even the seasons of society itself. Afternoon tea fit neatly into this choreography. The bell would ring, the guests would gather, and like clockwork, cakes would materialize. The predictability was part of the charm. You could set your watch by tea, or more likely, you could call for the butler to set it for you. And the timing wasn't only about food, it was about energy management. The Edwardians were professional socializers. They rose late, spent the morning riding or shopping, ate a light lunch, and then launched into an afternoon of visits, errands and engagements. By 4 o'clock, the collective energy of high society began to flag. Tea was less about filling bellies and more about refueling spirits, sugar for the body, caffeine for the brain, and gossip for the soul. In this sense, 4 o'clock tea was the Edwardian equivalent of a double espresso and a doom scroll, minus the Wi-Fi. Tea at 4 also provided a transition between day and evening. It was the hinge in the Edwardian schedule, the bridge between daytime respectability and nighttime indulgence. After tea, the tone shifted. Guests left, ladies changed gowns, men donned evening dress, and households prepared for the pageantry of dinner and theatre. Without the punctuation of afternoon tea, the day risked blending into an endless blur. Tea marked the moment when polite duty gave way to pleasure, when society collectively said, "We've made it this far, now let's have cake." There was also a subtle psychology to the timing. By ritualizing hunger at a specific hour, tea became not only predictable but performative. If you were important enough to stop your day at 4, you signalled your control over time itself. The working classes couldn't clock out at will, but the wealthy could pause life entirely for tea. It was leisure disguised as necessity. Nobody could argue with hunger, and nobody wanted to. Hotels and tea rooms capitalised on this schedule. Menus were tailored to the hour, with light bites that promised not to ruin dinner. Newspapers ran advertisements that assumed readers knew the sacredness of the 4 o'clock pause. Even railways timed certain services around tea, because nothing said civilization like enjoying Darjeeling between Birmingham and London. And while the tradition looked refined, it also had a sly indulgence to it. 4 o'clock meant sugar and cream, pastries and cakes, a little bit of luxury smuggled into the day under the guise of etiquette. Children had nursery teas earlier, workers had tea breaks later, but 4 o'clock belonged to the elite. It was hunger elevated to ritual, appetite elevated to art. In the end, the genius of afternoon tea wasn't the tea itself, it was the timing. By carving out a pause between meals, the Edwardians created not only a habit, but an institution. It was the hour where the day exhaled, where the stomach sighed with relief, and where society basked in the glow of shared indulgence. The Edwardians may not have had smartphones, but they knew the value of a scheduled break, and at 4 p.m, you could guarantee one thing: somewhere in Britain, a silver teapot was pouring, a sugar cube was dropping, and a perfectly respectable adult was eating cake while pretending it was a matter of necessity. If there was one thing the Edwardians loved more than tea, it was drinking it somewhere fabulous. Gone were the days when tea was confined to drawing rooms and parlours. By the turn of the 20th century, tea had spilled out of private homes and into the glittering world of public spaces, department stores, tea houses, and luxury hotels. Afternoon tea went from being a domestic ritual to a cultural spectacle, and the Edwardians embraced it with the enthusiasm of people who had just discovered how to put whipped cream on everything. The rise of the tea room was inseparable from the growth of the modern city. London was at the heart of this movement, but other cities like Manchester, Birmingham and Edinburgh quickly followed suit. Department stores led the charge. Take Harrods or Selfridges, for example. These weren't just shops, they were palaces of consumption, temples to the art of spending money. And what better way to keep customers lingering and buying than by offering a genteel place to sit down, sip tea, and nibble on pastries? The department store tea salon became both a shopping strategy and a social revolution. Why revolutionary? Because these salons offered something radical for the time: respectable spaces where women could gather in public without a male escort. Before tea rooms, unchaperoned women sitting in cafes risked scandal, or worse, being mistaken for working women of a different profession entirely. Tea rooms changed that. They gave middle and upper-class women their own public arena, a safe haven wrapped in lace tablecloths, and the soothing aroma of a psalm. Here, women conducted business, discussed politics, and planned charity work, all under the genteel camouflage of tea. In many ways, these tea salons were proto-coffee shops for the Edwardian feminist. Hotels weren't far behind in cashing in. The Edwardian era saw a boom in luxury hotels designed to cater to the wealth of the aristocracy and the ambitions of the middle classes. The Ritz in London became the place to take tea, so much so that the phrase tea at the Ritz entered the cultural lexicon. Savoy, Claridge's, and countless others competed for the crown of most glamorous tea service. These weren't just meals, they were events. Marble floors, gilded ceilings, orchestras playing discreetly in the background, and tiered stands loaded with delicacies. It was sensory overload disguised as refinement. If Starbucks existed in 1910, it would have had chandeliers, but it wasn't only about luxury. The Edwardians were also keen on the idea of accessibility, at least in the middle-class sense of the word. Chain tea shops like Lyons Corner Houses popped up across cities, offering affordable tea and cakes in clean, elegant surroundings. They became enormously popular, employing thousands of waitresses known as nippies, who darted between tables with military efficiency. For many Edwardians, particularly clerks and shopgirls, these tea houses were their daily refuge, providing not just refreshment but also a respectable social space at a reasonable price. Tea rooms and hotels also redefined courtship. Afternoon tea in a public setting was one of the few socially acceptable ways for men and women to meet outside family supervision. A stroll in Hyde Park might raise eyebrows, an invitation to dinner might be too forward, but an invitation to tea at a department store salon, perfectly respectable, with just enough room for stolen glances over teacups. For some Edwardians, romance was brewed alongside the Earl Grey. The design of these tea spaces mattered enormously. Interiors were often styled to evoke elegance and modernity at the same time. Stained glass windows, Art Nouveau flourishes, and elaborate chandeliers set the tone. A trip to a tea room wasn't just about food, it was about atmosphere. The Edwardian middle classes could sip their Darjeeling in surroundings that made them feel like aristocrats, even if their pay packet suggested otherwise. And then there was music. Many of the great hotel lounges offered live entertainment during tea. String quartets, pianists, or even small orchestras. Imagine sipping from a delicate china cup, while a violinist serenades you with Elgar. Afternoon tea became a multi-sensory performance, something between a meal and a cultural event. It was Instagrammable long before cameras could actually fit in pockets. Of course, not everyone adored the tea room craze. Critics sniffed that women were wasting too much time gossiping in public. Some traditionalists muttered that it blurred the boundaries between private and public life, and moralists fretted that too much tea drinking might encourage idleness or frivolity. Though one suspects they were just bitter. They weren't invited to the Ritz, yet the popularity was undeniable. By 1910, tea rooms were a fixture of urban life. They democratized elegance, gave women independence, provided venues for courtship, and kept department stores buzzing with business. Hotels turned tea into a spectacle of luxury, a ritual dripping with chandeliers, silver trays and music. And at every level, from the poshest Ritz to the humblest Lion's Corner house, the Edwardians embraced them. So when we imagine Edwardian afternoon tea, it's not just the private drawing rooms of stately homes that come to mind. It's bustling tea salons in department stores, grand hotel lounges echoing with music, and chain tea shops humming with chatter. Afternoon tea had broken out of the parlour and into the public square, and society was more caffeinated and more democratic for it. The Edwardians didn't just drink tea, they built cathedrals for it. If you think afternoon tea was about sipping Darjeeling and nibbling sandwiches, you're only halfway there. In Edwardian Britain, tea wasn't just about the menu, it was about the look. Attending afternoon tea was less about quenching thirst and more about making an entrance. In fact, what you wore to tea often mattered more than whether you liked Earl Grey or Assam. You weren't just drinking tea, you were performing status. And the stage costume? Lace, silk, gloves, and hats, large enough to require their own gravitational pull. The crown jewel of tea fashion was the tea gown. Unlike stiff day dresses or formal evening gowns, the tea gown was meant to be softer, looser, and more flowing. It was designed to combine comfort with elegance. A garment that whispered, "I am at ease in my own drawing room," but also shouted, "I paid a fortune for this lace." Tea gowns often featured delicate embroidery, trailing fabrics, and Art Nouveau flourishes. They were meant to blur the line between casual and formal, a kind of Edwardian athleisure, if athleisure involved 40 buttons and a corseted waist. But here's the twist. Tea gowns were originally meant for private, at-home teas. The hostess would don one to look graceful yet relaxed when entertaining guests. By the Edwardian era, however, tea gowns crept into public spaces. Department store salons and hotels became runways where women flaunted their tea gowns like peacocks showing their feathers. The whole point of a tea gown was that it wasn't practical. You couldn't scrub a floor or stir a pot in it, but you could stir scandal by wearing the latest Parisian style. Of course, the tea gown was only part of the equation. Hats were the true showstoppers. Edwardian millinery was a competitive sport. The bigger, the better. Hats were smothered in feathers, flowers, ribbons, and sometimes even entire taxidermied birds. The Edwardian hat craze coincided perfectly with the afternoon tea craze, because both offered maximum opportunities to be seen. A hat at tea wasn't just an accessory, it was a declaration of personality. And if your hat didn't block the sun for 3 other tables, were you even Edwardian? Gloves were another must. You didn't just waltz into a tea room with bare hands. Gloves were an essential symbol of propriety, and etiquette demanded that women wear them at tea. The trick, of course, was managing to hold a teacup with gloved fingers while not dunking your lace cuffs into the clotted cream. Men, too, sported gloves, often removing them delicately before sitting down, but never too early, lest anyone assume they were eager or uncouth. In Edwardian fashion, even your fingers were dressed for the occasion. Jewellery also made its mark. Afternoon tea was not the moment for tiaras. Those were reserved for grand evening occasions. but it was the perfect time to showcase brooches, delicate pearl necklaces, or understated diamond pins. Think of it as the Edwardian equivalent of quiet luxury. You wanted sparkle but not too much sparkle, lest someone accuse you of trying to upstage the hostess's tableware. Men weren't off the hook either. A gentleman attending tea needed to be turned out in proper day wear: morning coat, waistcoat, crisp tie, and polished shoes. While women dazzled with hats, men were expected to signal refinement through tailoring. A rumpled jacket at tea was social suicide, roughly equivalent to showing up to a wedding today in sweatpants. The fashion of tea was more than aesthetics. It was about the careful choreography of class and visibility. Clothing acted as a code, signalling who you were, how wealthy you were, and how closely you adhered to social expectations. The tea table was a silent competition, a runway where your gown, your gloves, and your hat all spoke volumes before you even touched your teacup. Department stores and milliners capitalized on this synergy between tea and fashion. Harrods, Selfridges, and Liberties didn't just sell gowns, they sold the idea of the tea lifestyle. Advertisements promised not just clothing, but entry into the refined world of Edwardian tea. The boom in hat making was directly tied to the visibility of women in tea rooms and hotels. A new hat wasn't just a purchase, it was an investment in one's social presentation. Fashion magazines of the era, like the Queen and Ladies' Field, ran endless features on what to wear to tea. The rules could be dizzying. Pale colours were preferred in summer, richer fabrics in winter. Lace was always fashionable, but too much velvet might feel evening instead of afternoon. These publications instructed their readers with the precision of military drill, because the battlefield of tea was won not with swords but with silken ostrich plumes. And of course the satire flowed freely. Cartoonists loved to lampoon women buried under colossal hats, or men fidgeting stiffly in their waistcoats while their wives fluttered fans and adjusted veils. The fashion of tea was ripe for parody, because everyone knew the unspoken truth. The spectacle often overshadowed the tea itself. In some Edwardian circles, the menu was almost incidental. It was the gowns, hats, and gloves that really mattered. In the end, afternoon tea was as much about performance as it was about refreshment. Every guest was an actor, every gown a costume, every hat a scene stealer. The teacup was merely a prop in the larger theatre of Edwardian fashion. And for those who played the part well, the applause came in the form of whispers. "Did you see her hat?" For all the sparkle of porcelain cups and rustle of silk gowns, afternoon tea would have fallen flat without the real stars of the show. The food. The Edwardians may have dressed like peacocks and gathered in grand salons, but at the end of the day their tea tables were shrines to carbohydrates. Edwardian carbs didn't ask permission, they just showed up in triplicate. And if you think the modern afternoon tea plate of one scone and a limp sandwich covers it, you haven't seen what Edwardians were capable of piling onto a three-tiered stand. Let's start with the finger sandwich, a culinary invention so delicate that it seemed designed specifically to make men grumble and women smile. The bread had to be thin, crust removed, and sliced into neat rectangles or triangles. Fillings were light and refined: cucumber, smoked salmon, egg and cress, thinly shaved ham, or chicken with a dab of mayonnaise. No one wanted to chew through a steak sandwich while pretending to gossip gracefully. Finger sandwiches were deliberately bite-sized, designed for polite nibbling while still leaving enough appetite for the sugar tsunami that followed. And the cucumber sandwich, in particular, became iconic: simple, crisp, refreshing, and strangely decadent for something that was basically a vegetable on bread. After sandwiches came the scones, and here, Edwardian tradition reached near religious fervour. A good scone had to strike the perfect balance: light yet substantial, crumbly but not dry, rich but not cloying. Served warm, split in half, and smothered with clotted cream and jam, the scone was a masterpiece of excess disguised as moderation. The only real controversy was the order: cream first, then jam, the Devon way, or jam first, then cream, the Cornish way. Edwardian society took sides with the passion of football fans, and one suspects more than one drawing room debate grew heated over the correct method. Then came the pastries and cakes, and this was where Edwardian bakers unleashed their artistry. Eclairs filled with custard, cream puffs dusted with sugar, slices of sponge layered with jam, Battenberg cakes with their checkerboard pattern wrapped in almond marzipan, and dainty fruit tarts glistening like jewels. Afternoon tea wasn't about moderation, it was a parade of sweetness, each pastry a tiny performance of elegance. You didn't just eat cake, you admired it, discussed it, and only then delicately demolished it. The fruitcake, dense, rich and spiced, was another staple. To modern taste buds, it might feel more Christmas than afternoon refreshment, but to Edwardians, it was the respectable backbone of the tea table. Paired with lighter sponges and airy meringues, it offered contrast, a reminder that tea was about abundance, variety, and layers of indulgence. One cannot forget the biscuits either. Shortbread, ginger snaps, and digestive biscuits made appearances, particularly in more middle-class settings where elaborate French pastries might have been out of reach. But don't underestimate them. A crisp, buttery biscuit dunked into hot tea could be every bit as satisfying as a cream-laden éclair. The Edwardians, naturally, managed to serve them with enough silver trays and porcelain plates to elevate even the humblest cookie to aristocratic status. The three-tiered stand became the ultimate symbol of this edible performance. Sandwiches on the bottom, scones in the middle, cakes and pastries on top. The structure wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Like Edwardian society itself, it was layered, hierarchical, and presented with absolute confidence that this was the natural order of things. The ritual of moving upward from savoury to sweet mirrored the progression of the meal, and offered guests a journey from sensible cucumber to "I regret nothing." But food at the tea table wasn't just about taste, it was about conversation, performance and identity. Offering delicate finger foods meant that no one risked a messy plate or a greasy stain. Everything was designed for elegance, food that could be eaten with fingertips rather than forks, that didn't require knives clattering against china, that encouraged graceful pauses and easy chatter. The tea table was a social lubricant as much as a culinary one, and its food reflected that. For the Edwardian middle classes, replicating the tea table became an important act of social aspiration. Even if you couldn't afford a dozen eclairs, you could still whip up a sponge cake or serve biscuits from a tin. Cookbooks and women's magazines of the day brimmed with recipes designed to help housewives produce the perfect tea spread. It wasn't just about feeding guests, it was about proving you knew the unspoken rules of refinement. There was, of course, a darker undercurrent. Sugar, flour, and tea were all products of empire, and the abundance on the Edwardian table was made possible by colonial exploitation, Caribbean sugar plantations, Indian tea estates, Canadian wheat, all fed the endless appetite for afternoon tea. But for Edwardians gathered around their tiered stands, these global realities were invisible. What mattered was the glittering spread in front of them, the chance to eat cake at 4 in the afternoon and call it refinement. And here's the irony. Despite all this effort, the Edwardian appetite for tea foods was as much about appearance as indulgence. Guests might nibble politely, taking half a sandwich or one scone, while the true feast was visual, the abundant spread, the sense of plenty, the reassurance that no one in the room would ever want for butter or cream. To attend an Edwardian tea was to be dazzled not only by taste but by the spectacle of food itself. In the end, the Edwardian tea table wasn't just a menu, it was a manifesto. Sandwiches proclaimed civility, scones whispered tradition, pastries shouted indulgence, and the three-tiered stand declared abundance. It was refinement stacked on porcelain, carbs in costume, sugar with a side of status. And if anyone judged you for reaching for a second eclair, just smile sweetly and remind them, "It's tea, darling. That's what it's for." If you think afternoon tea was just about sugar and scones, think again. In Edwardian Britain, tea was a networking platform long before anyone dreamed of Wi-Fi. It was the event where marriages were plotted, business deals floated, reputations cemented, and scandals whispered into existence. Forget the idea of tea as a light snack. It was a full-scale social marketplace, where your currency wasn't resume bullet points, but whether you poured milk before or after the tea. LinkedIn didn't exist, so cucumber sandwiches did the heavy lifting. The Edwardian elite knew that visibility was everything. Being seen at the right table, in the right tea room, with the right people, could make or break your social standing. Invitations to afternoon tea were a currency in their own right. To be excluded was a polite form of exile. To be included meant your reputation was still intact. And unlike balls or banquets, tea was intimate. 10 people at a table, conversation close enough to be conspiratorial. Perfect conditions for arranging everything from political alliances to discreet flirtations. Take matchmaking, for example. In Edwardian society, Marriages were not merely personal choices, but family strategies. Afternoon tea was the perfect setting for this genteel form of plotting. Mothers scanned the guest list like generals surveying a battlefield, steering daughters toward eligible bachelors over scones. A tea table could feel less like a social gathering and more like an open-air marriage market, albeit one softened by sponge cake. Here, young women displayed wit, charm, and just the right amount of appetite. Heaven forbid you demolish 3 eclairs before the introductions were made. But tea wasn't only about romance, it was about business. Gentlemen's clubs had long been the site of political scheming, but afternoon tea allowed deals to be conducted in mixed company, with a veneer of civility. Land transactions, investment proposals and charity patronage were all casually floated over Earl Grey. If you wanted your new idea heard, you didn't send a memo, you invited someone to tea. The Edwardians were masters of cloaking ambition in charm. Do try the Battenberg, and by the way, would you consider funding my railway? Reputations too were brewed over tea. Gossip was the invisible steam rising from every teapot. The Edwardians lived in a world where public image was everything, and afternoon tea was the perfect forum for the kind of whispered exchanges that could shape it. Who was seen leaving whose carriage? Whose estate was secretly drowning in debt? Which lady's pearls were real, and which were paste? These weren't idle questions. Reputations rose and fell with alarming speed, and tea tables were the unofficial news desks of high society. The Times reported politics, the tea table reported truths that actually mattered. For women especially, tea provided a unique platform. With limited access to formal political or economic power, many women wielded influence socially. Hosting a successful tea wasn't just about sandwiches and silver, it was about creating a networking hub. The right mix of guests could turn a drawing room into a nexus of influence, where marriages, charities and alliances were woven together with threads of gossip. A hostess who failed to orchestrate these gatherings risked irrelevance. One who succeeded could shape society in ways that outpaced her husband's parliamentary votes. Middle-class families recognized this too. For them, tea became a way of climbing the ladder. Hosting a respectable spread demonstrated both refinement and ambition. Inviting a local banker, a school headmaster, or the wife of a town official was the Edwardian equivalent of growing your professional network. By carefully curating their tea tables, middle-class hosts could edge themselves into circles that had once been closed to them. The very architecture of tea helped this networking function. Unlike formal dinners with rigid seating and multiple courses, tea was fluid. Guests could drift from group to group, balancing cups and plates while engaging in multiple conversations. This informality encouraged connections. It wasn't about one grand speech or toast. It was about dozens of small interactions, each a chance to drop a clever remark, a flattering compliment or a subtle suggestion. If Edwardian dinner was theatre, tea was speed dating with better upholstery. Of course, this networking power came with risks. A misplaced word, a poorly timed joke, or an ill-chosen guest could unravel reputations just as quickly as build them. Social climbing was a precarious sport, and afternoon tea was its arena. Everyone knew someone was always listening. A laugh at the wrong moment, a whisper overheard, and suddenly your carefully cultivated reputation could be reduced to crumbs faster than a biscuit dunked in hot tea. Yet for all its dangers, tea remained irresistible. It was where alliances were struck, where fortunes quietly shifted, where engagements were born, and where society revealed itself in miniature. The teapot was less a vessel for hot water, and more a cauldron of opportunity, swirling with ambition and sugar. So next time you imagine Edwardian tea, don't just picture lace gloves and silver trays. Picture a room humming with whispered deals, mothers maneuvering daughters into prime positions, businessmen disguising negotiations as compliments on sponge cake, and reputations teetering delicately on saucers. Afternoon tea wasn't just refreshment, it was the engine of Edwardian society, disguised as a snack. And when someone leaned across the table and murmured, "Do you take sugar?" they might just as well have been asking, "Do you take sides?" When people picture Edwardian afternoon tea, the mental image is almost always the same. Elegant women in flowing gowns, adjusting elaborate hats, delicately sipping from porcelain cups. Men, in this stereotype, are absent, often smoky gentlemen's clubs with brandy and cigars too manly to stoop to cucumber sandwiches. But the truth is more nuanced. Tea wasn't just for women, nor was it confined to dainty domestic rituals. Edwardian men drank plenty of tea. They just did it in ways that kept their masculinity intact, or at least that's what they told themselves. Some men claimed tea was too dainty, then secretly dunked biscuits when nobody was looking. To begin with, tea was everywhere in Edwardian Britain. It was the national beverage. Men drank it at breakfast, with lunch, during travel, and at supper. By the early 20th century, Britain imported staggering quantities of tea, and men were among its most enthusiastic consumers. Factory workers gulped strong brews to keep going during long shifts. Soldiers in the British Army swore by gunfire tea, black tea laced with rum, as both comfort and fortification. The association of tea exclusively with women was mostly tied to the ritual of afternoon tea, not the beverage itself. For men, the question wasn't whether they drank tea, but how, when, and where. Enter the gentlemen's clubs. These institutions, concentrated in London's Pall Mall and St James's, were the masculine equivalent of drawing rooms. Politics, business and leisure all mixed under their cavernous roofs. And yes, they served tea. Not necessarily the dainty three-tiered extravaganza of the Ritz, but solid, betemberal service, a pot of Assam, perhaps accompanied by buttered toast or seed cake. Men might not co over pastries, but they did rely on tea as part of their daily rhythm. Afternoon tea in clubs had a different flavour from hotel salons. It was quieter, more restrained, with less emphasis on spectacle. The tea was strong, the conversation often political, and the food plain but substantial. Think less delicate cucumber sandwich and more generous slice of fruitcake. While women's teas in hotels glittered with chandeliers and orchestras, men's club teas operated like refuelling stations between debates, billiards, or the House of Commons. Still, some Edwardian men felt uneasy about tea's association with femininity. The Edwardian era was a time of shifting gender roles, with women entering the workforce, demanding the vote, and asserting independence in public tea rooms. For men who valued tradition, tea could feel suspiciously like an encroachment on their territory. To frame it as dainty or feminine allowed them to dismiss it, even as they continued to drink it in private. Satirists poked fun at this hypocrisy. Cartoons depicted blustering men deriding afternoon tea, only to be caught later slurping with gusto when no one was watching. In fact, etiquette guides of the time reveal a subtle tension. Men were advised to accompany their wives, sisters or mothers to public teas, but not to appear too enthusiastic about the ritual. The proper Edwardian gentleman was supposed to maintain an air of indulgence, as if saying, "I am here because society requires it, not because I secretly love eau clairs." Beyond clubs, tea was central to male working life. In offices, tea trays circulated in the afternoon, providing clerks and managers alike with a burst of caffeine and sugar. In factories, tea breaks became an institution, offering weary men a chance to rest, gossip, and consume a brew strong enough to stand a spoon upright. Here, tea wasn't dainty at all. It was survival fuel. The Edwardian working man might sneer at delicate sandwiches, but he'd happily gulp a chipped mug of scalding tea between shifts. Even the sporting world embraced tea. Cricket matches famously paused for tea breaks, a tradition that persists to this day. Rowing regattas and lawn tennis tournaments often ended with tea tents where men in athletic whites refueled alongside women in gowns. Sports and tea became unexpectedly intertwined, physical exertion followed by social refreshment. The Edwardians knew that after chasing a ball for hours, nothing tasted better than a scone. For men in the dating game, tea provided opportunities just as much as it did for women. Inviting a lady to tea was considered respectable, a safe middle ground between the boldness of dinner and the stiffness of church. Tea allowed men to demonstrate charm, refinement and generosity, all without the heavy expense of a banquet. In this sense, tea was a man's ally. A clever remark over a teacup could secure more romantic progress than an entire season of waltzes. And then there were the soldiers. The British Army practically ran on tea. Campaign reports from the Boer War and beyond are filled with mentions of tea rations, tea making, and the morale-boosting powers of a hot brew. For soldiers, tea was not dainty, it was essential. It warded off fatigue, cold, and despair. In this context, tea was as masculine as gunpowder, a necessity of empire rather than a luxury of salons. So while the Edwardians might have publicly linked afternoon tea with women, the reality was that men drank just as much, if not more. In clubs, workplaces, barracks, and sporting fields, tea was as omnipresent as cigars or beer. Men simply framed it differently. Less about spectacle, more about substance. Afternoon tea may have been an arena of feminine visibility, but behind the scenes, men were drinking it all along. The irony, the same men who mocked cucumber sandwiches as frivolous were often the first to demand a refill when the teapot ran dry. Tea, in Edwardian Britain, wasn't feminine or masculine. It was simply British. And if a gentleman happened to dunk a biscuit when no one was watching, well, that was between him and the crumbs. For the Edwardian elite, afternoon tea was all elegance and leisure. Guests sat in drawing rooms or grand hotel lounges, lifting delicate cups with practiced grace, as though the silver tray had magically floated onto the table by divine will. But behind the lace curtains and polished silver, the ritual of tea was an elaborate production orchestrated by an invisible workforce of butlers, maids, cooks, and scullery staff. You didn't make your own tea. You barely made eye contact with the person who did. For every graceful sip in public, there was an army of servants hustling in the background to make sure nothing fell apart. Start with the butler. In wealthy Edwardian households, he was the director of the tea ceremony, the stage manager who made sure everything appeared effortless. He handled the silver, arranged the porcelain, and often supervised which blend of tea was used for the occasion. A butler's eye for detail could make or break the impression of refinement. If the sugar tongs weren't polished or the tea tray arrived late, it reflected poorly not just on him but on the entire household. The butler was expected to glide in silently, present the tray as though it weighed nothing, and vanish before anyone could register that human effort had been involved. To the guest, it was magic. To the butler, it was just another Tuesday. Below him in the hierarchy were the parlourmaids, who often carried the heavy load, sometimes literally. They laid the linen, fetched the trays, carried stacks of cups and saucers, and served guests when the hostess herself decided it was too much trouble. These young women were trained in etiquette almost as much as their employers, for a misstep in serving could ruin the effect. A clink of china too loud, a spoon handed the wrong way, or a tray wobbling into disaster could brand a maid as incompetent. Imagine the pressure. You're balancing a tower of teacups worth more than your annual wages, while a dozen aristocrats stare at you as if you're invisible until the second you make a mistake. Then there were the cooks, often forgotten in polite accounts of tea but central to its success. The endless parade of finger sandwiches, scones, tarts and cakes didn't appear out of thin air. A cook, with the help of kitchen maids, prepared every item with precision. Sandwiches required thin, uniform slices of bread, often baked in-house, paired with fillings cut so fine they bordered on microscopic. Scones had to be baked fresh, timed to perfection so they arrived warm, not cold and crumbly. Pastries demanded skill, and mistakes were unforgivable. A collapsed sponge cake could bring more shame to a household than a poorly chosen guest. Servants in the kitchen knew they were feeding not just hunger, but reputation. In the grandest homes, the ritual even extended to the scullery maids, who scrubbed every teapot, cup and saucer after the performance was over. With Edwardian households owning dozens, sometimes hundreds of fragile pieces of china, the workload was immense. A chipped cup could spell disaster, and replacing a broken piece might take weeks if it came from a bespoke set. For the scullery maid, each washing session was like defusing a bomb, one cup at a time. Hotels and tea rooms had their own servant hierarchies. Waitresses, often called nippies for their speed, darted between tables carrying trays laden with pots, plates and pastries. In luxury hotels like the Ritz or Claridge's, a small army of uniformed staff glided about in near silence, trained to anticipate needs before guests voiced them. Every movement was rehearsed, every gesture deliberate. Guests might never notice the footman who quietly refilled their teacup, but the absence of such attention would have been glaring. The irony, of course, was that tea was celebrated as the epitome of leisure. For the guests, it was the pause of the day, a chance to gossip, flirt, or simply indulge. For the servants, it was anything but restful. While the drawing room hummed with polite chatter, the kitchen and scullery rang with clattering trays, frantic slicing, and the hiss of boiling kettles. Servants often worked on their feet for hours, with no pause for their own tea until the guests had been satisfied. Afternoon tea might have symbolised relaxation, but for the working staff it was one of the busiest times of day. And yet the servants rarely received recognition. Their names didn't appear in society columns. Their hands set the stage, their labour baked the cakes, their polish made the silver shine, but they were trained to remain unseen. The perfect servant was the one you never noticed, a ghostly presence who ensured the illusion of effortless luxury remained intact. For the Edwardian elite, tea was about performance. For their servants, it was about precision. Two worlds coexisted at the same table, one floating on elegance, the other grinding under labour. And if the guests raised their cups in admiration of the hostess's taste, it was the butler, the maid, and the cook who had really earned the applause. Afternoon tea in Edwardian society was never just a meal, it was a stage production, an elaborate performance where every silver tray, every porcelain cup, every neatly folded napkin played its part. The tea table wasn't merely furniture, it was a carefully curated set, designed to impress, intimidate, and enchant. When guests walked into a drawing room or a hotel lounge for tea, they weren't just entering a social gathering, they were stepping into a play where the script was gossip, the costumes were gowns and gloves, and the set design was made of gleaming silver and three-tiered stands. If the sugar tongs didn't sparkle like Excalibur, something was wrong. The centerpiece of this drama was the table itself. In upper-class households, the hostess's tea table was more than a place to put cups. It was an altar to refinement. Linen was laid with military precision, spotless, ironed and preferably trimmed with lace or embroidery. On top of this pristine canvas sat an array of props that signalled wealth and taste. A gleaming silver tray was almost mandatory, bearing the teapot, hot water jug, sugar bowl, and cream jug. To present tea without the proper silver was akin to performing Hamlet without Hamlet. Porcelain cups and saucers played their roles too, and the choice of china mattered enormously. Guests noticed whether a hostess served tea in plain white cups or in gilded bone china, imported from Limoges. Patterns conveyed messages. Delicate florals suggested feminine charm. Bold geometric designs hinted at cosmopolitan flair, while heavy gilt edges screamed wealth lives here. Cups were thin enough that light shone through the porcelain, a visible reminder that the hostess spared no expense. Holding such a cup wasn't just about drinking tea, it was about acknowledging the performance of refinement. Then there was the teapot itself, the star prop in this daily play. In wealthy homes, silver teapots were polished until they gleamed like mirrors, and the reflection of flickering candlelight or afternoon sunshine made them seem almost magical. Porcelain pots were equally fashionable, especially those hand-painted or imported from Asia. The sound of tea being poured, the gentle clink of lid against handle, was as much a part of the experience as the liquid itself. Guests didn't just sip tea, they listened to it. But no item captured the theatricality of Edwardian tea like the tiered stand. Introduced in the late 19th century, these three-level contraptions became the visual centerpiece of the table. Sandwiches sat obediently on the bottom, scones occupied the middle, and cakes and pastries reigned at the top like edible royalty. The progression was deliberate, savoury to sweet, bottom to top, mirroring the social climb of aspiration. The stand itself became a miniature stage, each level a different act in the drama of indulgence. To dismantle it carelessly, say by lunging for a top-tier eclair too soon, was as gauche as skipping a scene in a play. Accessories added more layers to the performance. Sugar tongs, often crafted from silver and engraved with ornate designs, were wielded like sceptres, passed around with the solemnity of a crown jewel. Milk jugs and sugar bowls had to match the teapot and tray. A mismatched set suggested chaos, a failure in stage direction. Napkins, folded into neat squares or triangles, reinforced the illusion of order. Even the teaspoons gleamed with choreographed polish. Every piece had to work in harmony, like the cast of an ensemble show. Lighting mattered too. Afternoon sunlight was often filtered through lace curtains, casting a soft glow over porcelain and silver. In the winter months, candles or electric lamps added warmth and shimmer, turning the table into a glittering island of civility against the gloom outside. For the Edwardians, even the play of light on silverware was part of the performance. If the gleam wasn't dazzling enough, it reflected poorly on the hostess's competence. What made this theatricality so effective was its illusion of effortlessness. Behind the scenes, servants had scoured, polished, arranged and reheated, but to the guests, it all had to appear as natural as breathing, a perfectly balanced tray arriving in silence, a spotless teapot pouring without a drip, a tower of pastries waiting like jewels. It was stagecraft, pure and simple. The audience clapped not with their hands but with their raised eyebrows of approval. For middle-class households, the tea table was no less theatrical, even if the budget was smaller. A carefully ironed cloth, a modest china set, and perhaps a single cake or plate of biscuits could still create the illusion of refinement. The props might have been fewer, but the play was the same. Show your neighbours that you knew how to put on the ritual. Even in modest homes, tea tables were treated with reverence, as if they were little theatres where families rehearsed the manners of the upper classes. Hotels, of course, took this to operatic extremes. The Ritz and Claridge's staged tea like a grand production, complete with orchestras, gilded mirrors, and waiters who moved like actors gliding across a stage. The tea table wasn't just a table, it was a set piece in a larger drama of luxury. Guests paid not only for sandwiches and scones, but for the privilege of starring in the spectacle, if only for an afternoon. In the end, the Edwardian tea table was theatre at its finest. Illusion, performance, and spectacle, all wrapped around something as ordinary as a hot drink. Every polished spoon, every embroidered napkin, every precarious pastry tower reminded guests that they weren't just eating, they were participating in a ritualized drama. The food would be gone, the tea drunk, but the memory of the performance lingered, and if the sugar tongs failed to sparkle, well, that was the equivalent of forgetting your lines on opening night. Afternoon tea in Edwardian Britain was not just about eating or drinking, it was a minefield of rules. The table was a stage, but you weren't allowed to improvise. Every gesture, every sip, every flick of the wrist came under scrutiny. To stir incorrectly, to slouch in your chair, or heaven forbid, to slurp your tea was to risk social embarrassment so devastating you might as well pack your bags for exile in the colonies. Stir your tea clockwise, not counterclockwise, unless you want to start a class war. At the heart of Edwardian etiquette was the concept of restraint. You were meant to show control in everything, your posture, your voice, your appetite. The most important rule, never appear greedy. Afternoon tea was about abundance, but the paradox was that you were supposed to behave as though you were indifferent to it. When the three-tier stand was placed before you, your task was not to lunge for the eclairs, but to wait politely until the hostess offered, accept too eagerly, and you looked gluttonous, refuse too firmly, and you insulted the hostess. The correct path was to hesitate just long enough to look modest before finally taking a dainty sandwich. How you handled the cup was equally critical. Edwardians prided themselves on never sticking out their pinkies like caricatures in cartoons. Instead, you pinched the handle with thumb and forefinger, keeping the other fingers curved gently inward. Holding the cup like a mug was unthinkable. Balancing it like a sacred relic was the expectation. The saucer travelled with you if you stood up or moved around. To abandon it on the table while clutching your cup was a minor scandal, akin to leaving your wallet behind in a taxi. Then came the art of stirring. You did not whirl your spoon in circles like you were mixing soup. That was barbaric. The correct method was to gently move the spoon back and forth from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock, in near silence. The spoon must never clang against the cup, and once finished, it was to be placed neatly on the saucer. Never, under any circumstances, left upright in the cup. To do so suggested you had no manners at all, and worse, risked poking your eye out should you lean in too eagerly for a sip. Speaking of sipping, slurping was a crime of the highest order. A proper Edwardian sip was silent, delicate, and controlled, the kind of action that suggested you were merely tasting, not guzzling. Tea was to be enjoyed, not consumed in gulps like beer at a tavern. And don't even think about blowing on it if it was too hot. Better to burn your tongue than reveal such a lack of breeding. Posture was another battlefield. Guests were expected to sit upright, shoulders back, chin lifted, as though they were modelling for a portrait. Slouching signalled laziness, crossing your legs was frowned upon, and sprawling in your chair was a declaration of social death. For women, ankles had to remain discreetly hidden beneath skirts, even while seated. For men, lounging like one was in a smoking room was unacceptable. At tea, even your skeleton was expected to behave. Conversation had rules too. Afternoon tea was not the moment for politics or heavy debates. Topics were light, witty, and socially safe. The weather, the opera, who had been seen at last night's ball, or the latest scandal whispered about in hushed tones. Jokes had to be clever but never crude, and laughter was encouraged, provided it didn't rattle the teacups. To dominate conversation was rude, but so was withdrawing completely. Guests were expected to contribute just enough, like adding sugar to tea, enhancing without overpowering. Even how you approached the food came under regulation. Sandwiches were eaten with fingers, never knives and forks. Scones were not bitten into whole but broken gently by hand. You spread cream and jam with grace, not like plastering mortar on a wall. Pastries were trickier, and the expectation was that you handled them neatly, regardless of how sticky or crumbly they were. Anyone who left jam smears on a napkin was marked as hopelessly careless. For the hostess, the etiquette load was even heavier. She was responsible for pouring tea, a task carried out with ritualistic precision. Milk was offered, but the guest's preference, milk before or after the tea, had to be respected. Sugar was passed with tongs, not fingers. The hostess also managed the pacing of the event, ensuring conversation flowed, cups were refilled, and no guest felt neglected. Hosting tea wasn't leisure, it was a high-wire act disguised as grace. The stakes of these rules were high, because afternoon tea was more than a refreshment, it was a test. Each participant's behaviour signalled their breeding, their refinement, and their awareness of social codes. To commit an error wasn't just embarrassing, it could damage one's reputation. People were judged on whether they remembered to dab lips with napkins before sipping, on whether they spoke too loudly, on how precisely they folded a napkin at the end. A single faux pas could fuel gossip for weeks. And yet, for all its rigidity, Edwardian tea etiquette had its charms. The rules turned a simple act into an art form. Guests participated in a shared choreography, and when everyone played their part correctly, the performance had a kind of elegance unmatched by any casual meal. It was exhausting, yes, but also exhilarating. Everyone knew their lines, everyone played their roles, and the result was a perfect social ballet. Of course, behind all this discipline was the humour of it all. Edwardian society pretended that stirring a spoon incorrectly could bring about the collapse of civilization, but really, it was just another way to keep everyone in their place. Rules disguised as refinements, all wrapped around a pot of tea. When one imagines Edwardian afternoon tea, the picture is usually set in London, a glittering hotel lounge, strings of violins floating in the background, women in elaborate hats sipping delicately from porcelain cups. But Britain was not just London. Beyond the capital's chandeliers and society gossip, tea took on many different lives across the country. Regional traditions shaped how people brewed it, sweetened it, served it, and even how they argued about it. Afternoon tea in London might have been a performance of refinement, but in other parts of Britain, it was often faster, louder, and occasionally served with more jam than etiquette. In Yorkshire, your tea came with extra sugar and less patience. London, of course, was the epicentre of fashion. Tea in the capital meant hotels like the Ritz or Claridge's, salons in Harrods, and private drawing rooms where etiquette guides were practically memorised. It was where afternoon tea became theatre, dripping in guilt and etiquette, a daily audition for social standing. But travel north and the ritual shifted. Yorkshire households brewed their tea strong enough to jolt you awake, even after a 12-hour shift in the mills. Sugar wasn't a delicate spoonful, but a hearty heap. Milk wasn't frothed and coaxed, it was splashed in with no ceremony at all. Where Londoners fussed about which pastry to nibble first, Yorkshire folk got on with the business of drinking tea that could stand up to dunked bread or a slab of fruit loaf. In the industrial cities of the north, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, tea was woven into working-class culture as much as high societies. For factory workers, a tea might mean a hearty evening meal, not just a snack at 4. The phrase high tea referred to something entirely different from London's fashionable afternoon spread. In working households, high tea was the evening meal. Meat pies, bread, potatoes, and yes, a pot of tea strong enough to put hair on your chest. It was practical, filling, and worlds away from cucumber sandwiches and silver sugar tongs, yet it still carried the same symbolic weight. Tea was the centrepiece, the drink that held the meal and the family together. Scotland had its own twists. Strong black teas were preferred, often blends designed to withstand the harsher water of the Highlands and Lowlands. Tea tables in Scottish homes could be as elaborate as their English counterparts, but the food often leaned toward oatcakes, shortbread, and scones thicker and heavier than the delicate versions found in London hotels. Hospitality was central. To refuse tea in a Scottish home was almost an insult. The kettle was nearly always on, and visitors expected, and were expected to drink. Afternoon tea here was less about theatre and more about warmth, a daily reassurance that community and comfort mattered more than appearances. In Wales, tea took on its own flavour as well. Bara brith, a fruit bread spiced with cinnamon and soaked with tea, often appeared alongside scones and butter. Welsh cakes, cooked on a griddle and dusted with sugar, became staples of the tea table. Just as in Scotland, the emphasis leaned toward hearty hospitality. For Welsh families, tea wasn't an excuse to show off silver, it was an excuse to feed people until they couldn't move. The divide between countryside and city added another layer. In rural villages, afternoon tea was stripped of much of its formality. Farmhouses served thick bread with butter, local cheeses, or homemade jams, washed down with strong tea poured from enamel teapots rather than porcelain. Tea breaks punctuated farm work, not society calendars, and the idea of following precise etiquette about stirring or sauces would have seemed laughable. But these country teas, hearty and generous, were no less central to Edwardian life. They reflected a different kind of abundance, one born from labour, not chandeliers. Meanwhile, in southern England beyond London, tea had its own quirks. Devon and Cornwall were already locked in their eternal battle over how to assemble a scone. In Devon, it was cream first, jam second. In Cornwall, it was jam first, cream second. To outsiders, it might sound like a trivial detail. To locals, it was nothing short of war. Families swore by their method, and to commit the opposite order was practically treasonous. An Edwardian visiting Devon might politely obey the local way, but they'd whisper at home about the wrongness of it. Regional differences even extended to the type of tea preferred. In London, Darjeeling and Ceylon blends dominated the fashionable market. In northern homes, cheaper but stronger Assam blends were favoured, often brewed darker and sweetened heavily. In Scotland, the water's mineral content demanded special blends that could hold their flavour. These preferences weren't just about taste, they reflected geography, class and the industrial realities of each region. Tea was as much about where you came from as it was about what you poured into your cup. And while London society pages obsessed over who was seen sipping tea at the Ritz, local papers across the provinces often reported on tea gatherings of a different sort: church teas, charity teas, and community socials. These events were less about fashion and more about solidarity, often raising funds for schools, chapels, or hospitals. In these halls, there were no orchestras or gilt cups, just trestle tables groaning under the weight of homemade cakes and endless pots of strong, no-nonsense tea. So while Edwardian afternoon tea is often remembered as a spectacle of hats and silverware, the truth is more complex. Across Britain, the ritual was reshaped by geography, class and tradition. In London, tea was theatre. In Yorkshire, it was strength in a cup. In Scotland and Wales, it was hospitality. In the countryside, it was sustenance. The only constant was that tea, in whatever form, anchored daily life. Every dainty sip of tea in Edwardian Britain carried with it the weight of empire. The porcelain cups, the sugar cubes, the fragrant leaves steeped in hot water, none of it was homegrown. Tea, the lifeblood of Edwardian society, was steeped not just in boiling water but in global trade, colonial ambition, and the labour of people thousands of miles away. Globalisation tasted like Darjeeling and guilt. By the early 20th century, Britain had established itself as the world's tea superpower. The East India Company had broken China's near monopoly on tea in the 19th century, turning instead to India and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, as primary producers. These plantations, sprawling across the hills of Assam, Darjeeling, and the lush highlands of Ceylon, were the beating heart of the Edwardian teapot. Every leaf that floated in London cups had been picked by labourers working long hours, often for meagre wages, under the watchful eyes of overseers determined to keep the empire's profits flowing. The Edwardians rarely thought about this. To them, the tea arriving in their shops and hotels was simply part of Britain's natural abundance, as reliable as the trains that carried it. But the reality was far harsher. Plantations demanded immense labour, much of it carried out by women and children who plucked leaves under the sweltering sun. They lived in cramped quarters, their health and well-being secondary to the relentless demand for exports. For those in Britain enjoying cucumber sandwiches, the human cost of tea was invisible, hidden behind the gleam of silver teapots and the glamour of hotel lounges. India alone produced astonishing quantities of tea for Britain. Assam teas were robust and malty, strong enough to hold up under milk and sugar, which suited northern English preferences. Darjeeling, often called the champagne of teas, was lighter, floral, and prized by the fashionable classes in London who wanted refinement in a cup. Each variety became tied to a sense of identity, robust for industry, delicate for society, all equally tethered to imperial exploitation. Ceylon's rise as a tea producer was equally dramatic. Formerly dominated by coffee plantations, a fungal disease in the mid-19th century devastated the crop. Enter tea, which thrived in the highlands. By the Edwardian period, Ceylon tea was a brand in itself, marketed as bright, brisk and modern. British companies poured money into these estates, reaping profits while local workers bore the cost. To sip a cup of Ceylon in an Edwardian tea room was to taste not just refreshment, but an entire system of colonial power dressed up as civility. And it wasn't only India and Ceylon. Britain sourced teas from Africa, particularly Kenya, which was just beginning to emerge as a tea-growing region in the Edwardian years. Though smaller in scale at the time, these African plantations hinted at the global spread of tea production that would accelerate later in the century. The empire's teapot was enormous, and Britain had no shame in boasting that it owned the kettle. The marketing of these teas was itself a colonial performance. Advertisements in Edwardian newspapers and magazines touted the exotic origins of each blend: pure Darjeeling, finest Assam, Ceylon's brightest. The names dripped with imperial pride. Packaging often featured images of idyllic plantations or cheerful native workers, conveniently glossing over the harsh conditions of actual labour. For the Edwardian consumer, the empire was sold as an endless buffet of luxuries, and tea was its most ubiquitous dish. Sugar, too, tied into these colonial connections. Much of it came from Caribbean plantations, themselves rooted in a history of slavery and exploitation. By the Edwardian period, Britain had shifted to wage labour in its colonies, but the shadow of slavery still hung over every lump of sugar dropped into a teacup. Add in porcelain imported from Asia and silver mined abroad, and the Edwardian tea table was a perfect microcosm of empire. Local in appearance, global in substance, built on the backs of those who never sat at the table. Yet the irony was sharp. Tea was celebrated in Britain as a national tradition, the most British of beverages. To refuse tea was unthinkable, to criticise it almost treasonous. But the drink itself was entirely foreign in origin, its ubiquity made possible only by Britain's colonial reach. Afternoon tea was the empire distilled into liquid form. Exotic goods made domestic, foreign labour turned invisible, global domination disguised as domestic civility. Some critics of the time did note this contradiction. A few reformers and commentators pointed out the uncomfortable realities of plantation labour and the exploitative nature of global trade, but their voices were drowned out by the clinking of teacups in drawing rooms across the nation. For most Edwardians, it was far easier to focus on etiquette and tiered stands than to think about the sweat behind each leaf. In the end, every Edwardian tea was a reminder of Britain's empire, whether or not anyone acknowledged it. From the hills of Assam to the parlours of London, tea connected lives across continents most unequally. For the guest at the Ritz, it was leisure. For the plantation worker in Ceylon, it was labour. Together, they formed the two halves of the same empire, united in a single, steaming cup. By the Edwardian period, tea was no longer just a drink, it was a booming industry, and industries thrive on one thing above all else: advertising. To keep tea flowing into every cup, merchants and brands turned to marketing strategies as elaborate as the tea tables themselves. Posters, packaging, newspaper ads, and shopfront displays transformed tea from a colonial import into a polished symbol of domestic necessity. And naturally, they did it with flair, exaggeration, and the occasional promise that their blend would solve problems. It clearly could not. Buy our blend, guaranteed to make your gossip 30% juicier. Tea companies understood their audience. Edwardian society was layered with class distinctions, and so advertisements had to appeal to both the aspiring middle classes and the entrenched elite. For the middle classes, tea was marketed as refinement in a cup. Posters promised that even a modest home could become genteel if it served the right blend. The message was simple: pour this tea, and your parlour instantly ascends a rung on the social ladder. For the upper classes, the pitch was exclusivity. Advertisements boasted of finest Darjeeling or pure Ceylon, framing tea as a luxury product that separated the discerning from the ordinary. The visuals were just as important. Colour lithography had made advertising vibrant by the early 20th century, and tea companies seized the chance to splash their posters with images of steaming cups, elegant women, and exotic landscapes. An Edwardian strolling down a London street might be confronted with a giant image of a smiling woman serving tea to a well-dressed family, the caption proclaiming that their happiness was courtesy of a particular brand. It wasn't just tea, it was domestic bliss, marital harmony, and good health all brewed in one pot. Brands leaned heavily into the empire's global reach. Posters often depicted plantation workers in idyllic, sun-drenched fields, baskets of leaves on their backs, smiling as though plucking tea under colonial supervision was the greatest joy on earth. These sanitized images erase the exploitation behind production, while presenting empire as something cheerful, bountiful, and permanent. For Edwardian consumers, buying tea wasn't just shopping, it was participating in Britain's imperial narrative. To sip Lipton's or Brook Bond was to affirm Britain's global power, one cup at a time. Sir Thomas Lipton was a master at this game. By the Edwardian era, his name was synonymous with accessible, branded tea. Lipton understood that packaging was as crucial as product. He pioneered sealed packets of tea that guaranteed purity and freshness. Unlike loose tea sold from barrels in grocers' shops, which could be adulterated with anything from dust to hedge clippings, the sealed packet not only reassured customers but also carried his name directly into their kitchens. Lipton's advertising campaigns were relentless, promising affordable quality to the masses and hammering home the idea that branded tea was modern tea. Other companies followed suit, and branding wars erupted. Brook Bond, Twinings, Mazzawati, each vied for market dominance through clever slogans and memorable visuals. The Mazzawati Tea Company, for instance, produced some of the era's most famous posters, showing cosy family scenes with steaming cups, always with the suggestion that happiness itself was steeped in their blend. For these companies, selling tea wasn't just about taste, it was about selling an identity, a mood, a story. The newspapers too were saturated with tea adverts. Pages of the Times or the Illustrated London News would feature elegant half-page spreads extolling the virtues of particular blends. Some leaned on pseudoscience, claiming their tea aided digestion, soothed nerves or boosted energy. Others played on moral undertones, suggesting that offering cheap or impure tea to guests was a sign of poor character. A good host, the adverts implied, didn't just provide tea, they provided the right tea. Shop fronts embraced spectacle as well. Grocers displayed tea chests and branded posters in their windows, sometimes even constructing elaborate models out of tea tins. Tea wasn't hidden in the back, it was showcased, flaunted as a modern essential. Department stores took this even further, creating entire sections dedicated to teas from around the world. Shopping for tea became an event, wrapped in the allure of travel, luxury and discovery, even if the buyer was just walking home to a terraced house in Manchester. Advertising also played on the sociability of tea. Many posters depicted scenes of groups gathered around tables, smiling, gossiping and connecting. The underlying promise was clear: this tea doesn't just taste good, it improves your social life. Serve the right brand, and your gatherings will be smoother, your conversations livelier, your guests more impressed. Gossip wasn't a side effect, it was part of the marketing pitch. Of course, the exaggerations bordered on comedy. Ads promised energy levels that rivaled electricity, digestive miracles, and serene nerves in the most anxious of times. Some even claimed that tea was the perfect drink for children, portraying rosy-cheeked youngsters sipping from cups as though caffeine and sugar were the foundations of good parenting. If modern energy drink commercials promise wings, Edwardian tea ads promised sainthood in china cups. What's striking is how seamlessly advertising fused the worlds of empire, domesticity and aspiration. Tea was marketed as both exotic and familiar, both a luxury and a necessity. It was an empire product, but it was sold as the heart of home. The brilliance of Edwardian advertising lay in convincing people that every cup connected them to something larger, a global empire, a social ideal, a family dream. And so the Edwardian tea craze wasn't just fueled by plantations abroad and rituals at home, it was also stoked by the bright posters on every street corner, the jingles in every newspaper, and the branded packets in every kitchen. Advertising didn't just sell tea, It sold the story of tea. And in Edwardian Britain, that story was irresistible. If afternoon tea was the Edwardian obsession, technology was its enabler. By the early 20th century, Britain was a nation in love with invention, speed, and industrial convenience, and tea found itself at the centre of these modern marvels. No longer confined to the slow rhythms of drawing rooms, tea was now shaped, transported, and consumed in ways only possible through the machinery of the industrial age. The Edwardians had fast trains, but their Wi-Fi was still just yelling. Start with the trains. Railways revolutionised tea long before Edward VII ascended the throne, but by the Edwardian years their impact was fully entrenched. Tea from India and Ceylon arrived in London docks by ship, but from there it had to reach warehouses, grocers, hotels and homes across the nation. Without railways, this process would have been glacial. With them, tea could be distributed in record time, ensuring fresh leaves reached even the furthest corners of Britain. Northern towns, Scottish villages, Welsh mining communities, all were plugged into the national tea circuit thanks to steel rails. The rhythm of tea was no longer local, it was national, as synchronised as the timetables printed in railway stations. Railways also created new cultural associations with tea. Railway refreshment rooms became iconic, though not always fondly remembered for serving scalding cups of strong tea to passengers dashing between connections. They were utilitarian, less glamorous than Ritz lounges, but they embedded tea into the very experience of modern travel. An Edwardian could step off a train in Birmingham, grab a hurried cup, and feel instantly connected to a national ritual. Tea became the fuel of mobility, a companion to the modern rhythm of movement. The telegraph, though less directly linked to sipping, shaped tea culture in subtler ways. It sped up commerce, allowing tea merchants to place orders, track shipments, and respond to demand almost instantly compared to earlier eras. The global networks of communication ensured that when harvests were strong in Assam or weak in Ceylon, London merchants knew within hours, not months. This rapid flow of information stabilised supply, streamlined pricing, and ensured that the Edwardians never faced a serious tea drought. The same wires that carried news of politics and war also guaranteed that Mrs. Brown in Brighton could still enjoy her afternoon Darjeeling. In the home and in hotels, tea was reshaped by industrial kitchens. The Edwardian years saw an explosion of technological appliances, gas ovens, improved stoves, and even the earliest electric kettles in experimental form. In large houses, servants benefited from more efficient ranges that could keep water constantly at a boil, ready for the hostess's signal. In hotels, industrial kitchens allowed for the mass production of scones, sandwiches and pastries, ensuring that hundreds of guests could be served simultaneously without collapse. Afternoon tea as a public ritual, with dozens or even hundreds of guests gathered at once, would have been nearly impossible without these innovations humming away out of sight. Factories also transformed the way tea was packaged and sold. Advances in mechanised blending and packing allowed brands like Lipton and Brooke Bond to churn out uniform products at scales unimaginable a century earlier. No longer did tea arrive as loose, anonymous leaves scooped from barrels at grocers. Edwardians increasingly bought pre-measured, sealed packets, the product of machinery that guaranteed consistency. Technology made branding possible, and branding made tea modern. Outside the home, the synergy between tea and the Edwardian industrial landscape was obvious. Office workers and clerks enjoyed tea breaks enabled by new systems of scheduling and productivity. Factory whistles that signalled the end of shifts often also signalled time for tea. The labour that powered the Industrial Revolution was fuelled by strong brews poured from enamel pots into tin mugs. Technology created the demand for efficiency, and tea was the lubricant that kept Britain's machines and its workers running. Steamships too deserve mention. Faster and larger than their 19th century predecessors, they made the journey from Asia to Britain swifter and more reliable. Tea could now travel thousands of miles across oceans with fewer risks of spoilage. Faster journeys meant fresher leaves, and fresher leaves meant happier Edwardians. Maritime technology kept Britain's teapots brimming, the empire's arteries pumping with caffeine. And let's not forget electricity. While it hadn't yet infiltrated every home, the Edwardians were enamoured with its possibilities. Some households experimented with electric kettles, though most still boiled water on stoves. In hotels, however, Electricity illuminated tea rooms with brilliant new lighting, casting chandeliers and mirrored walls in dazzling glow. Technology didn't just serve the tea, it made the entire ritual brighter, cleaner, and more theatrical. The interplay between tea and technology also had symbolic power. Tea represented tradition, continuity, and ritual. Technology embodied speed, progress, and disruption. Together, they created a uniquely Edwardian paradox, a society clinging to its rituals even as it embraced the thrill of modernity. The teapot, timeless in form, was filled with leaves delivered by steamship, brewed with water boiled on gas ranges, and poured for guests arriving by train. Each sip of tea was, in a sense, a fusion of ancient habit and cutting-edge innovation. It is easy to laugh now at how breathlessly Edwardians embraced these new marvels, but their enthusiasm was genuine. For them, every technological advance, every railway timetable, every humming kitchen range was a reassurance that the modern world could coexist with tradition. Afternoon tea was proof. No matter how fast trains moved, no matter how quickly telegraphs ticked, there was always time at 4 o'clock to pause, pour, and partake in the national ritual. For centuries, the rituals of refinement had belonged to Britain's elite. Tea, when it first arrived in the 17th century, was so expensive it was locked away in caddies like treasure. By the time of the Edwardians, however, the picture had changed dramatically. Tea had trickled down from duchesses and dowagers to clerks, shopkeepers, teachers and governesses. It was no longer just an aristocratic indulgence. It was a democratic luxury. Finally, status you could sip for a penny. The Edwardian middle class was booming. Industrialization had created a new class of professionals and small business owners. Clerks in offices, shopkeepers behind counters, teachers in classrooms, and civil servants in town halls all carved out lives distinct from both the landed aristocracy above and the working classes below. They didn't own estates, but they owned respectability, and tea was one of the most visible ways to perform it. Unlike the upper classes, who could employ butlers and maids to orchestrate grand displays, the middle classes made do with more modest resources. Yet they were no less determined to put on a show. A small dining table might be draped in a carefully ironed cloth, a china set purchased on instalment, and a spread of homemade cakes or biscuits. The effect mattered more than the expense. A clerk's wife serving scones on delicate plates could signal that her household belonged to the world of refinement, even if her husband's wages were modest. Tea was the social equalizer, an accessible ritual that gave middle-class families a chance to play the same game as their betters. Department store tea rooms played a major role in this democratization. These spaces allowed middle-class women to meet friends, conduct errands, or even host gatherings without the expense of a grand drawing room. For a modest sum, they could sit beneath chandeliers, sip a blend marketed as finest, and nibble pastries that came straight from industrial ovens. It was a shortcut to elegance, and the middle classes embraced it wholeheartedly. Even the architecture of these tea rooms was designed to blur the line between aspiration and affordability. You could pay a few pennies and walk into an atmosphere that mimicked the luxury of hotels like the Ritz. At home, the ritual took on a slightly different flavour. Teachers or governesses might serve tea in parlours where bookshelves stood proudly as markers of education, not wealth. Shopkeepers' families might gather around tables in back rooms above the shop, where tea offered both refreshment and a performance of gentility. Clerks, exhausted from balancing ledgers all day, could return home to a pot of strong Ceylon poured into cups that might have been mismatched but were still polished with care. For the middle classes, tea was both daily comfort and social strategy. The foods served reflected this balance. While the upper classes could afford eclairs and Battenberg cakes, middle-class households leaned towards simpler fare: sponge cakes, seed cakes, biscuits, and jam tarts made from seasonal fruit. Sandwiches might be filled with ham or cheese rather than salmon or caviar. Scones were often homemade, a little rougher around the edges but no less satisfying. The abundance mattered less than the appearance of order and civility. Every plate was arranged with precision, even if the contents came from a local grocer instead of a Parisian pâtisserie. Magazines and cookbooks of the era fed this middle-class ambition. Titles like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management offered endless advice on how to host tea with taste but without extravagance. Articles reminded readers that refinement was not about lavish spending, but about proper manners, neat presentation, and knowing the unspoken rules. In effect, middle-class families could buy a ticket into Edwardian gentility through knowledge and effort rather than inherited wealth. Tea was a passport, and anyone with a teapot could apply. There was also a moral dimension. For many in the middle class, especially teachers and clerics, tea was promoted as a wholesome alternative to alcohol. In an era when the temperance movement had momentum, tea offered a respectable beverage that could be enjoyed in groups without the dangers of drunkenness. Hosting a tea party was a declaration of sobriety, respectability, and modernity. It signalled that you were not only aspiring to refinement, but also committed to moral values. The economic reality cannot be ignored. By 1910, tea had become remarkably cheap compared to its earlier history. Industrial-scale shipping and packaging meant that even the working poor could afford a basic blend. For the middle classes, this affordability was transformative. A clerk could buy tea regularly without straining the budget, and shopkeepers could stock blends that their customers actually recognised from advertisements. The very brands that the aristocracy flaunted in glossy ads were now within reach of ordinary families. For a penny or two, anyone could claim a slice of the empire's bounty. The middle-class embrace of tea also influenced rituals beyond the home. Schools, offices, and community halls hosted teas as part of social calendars. Teachers held end-of-term teas for pupils and parents. Churches organised fundraising teas, and professional associations gathered around tables laden with sponge cakes. Each event reinforced the idea that tea wasn't just refreshment, but the social glue of Edwardian respectability. In many ways, the Edwardian middle class perfected the art of aspirational tea. They couldn't match the luxury of the Ritz or the sparkle of aristocratic drawing rooms, but they didn't need to. Their tea tables carried the same message: order, civility, aspiration. With a teapot, some cups, and a willingness to follow the rules of etiquette, they could place themselves firmly on the ladder of refinement. Tea was never just about thirst. For the Edwardian middle class, it was about belonging. It was about bridging the gap between wealth and work, between aspiration and reality. It was about showing that while they may not have inherited estates, they had inherited the values of refinement, and they could prove it with every poured cup. If afternoon tea was the stage on which Edwardians performed class and refinement, it also became a stage for something far more radical: politics. For the suffragettes, those bold campaigners demanding the right for women to vote, tea rooms and tea tables became unlikely battlegrounds. They weren't storming Parliament with scones in hand, but they were plotting in the safest, most respectable spaces they could find. Votes for women, with a side of Victoria sponge. At first glance, tea rooms hardly seem revolutionary. Lace curtains, polite chatter, waitresses in crisp aprons darting about with trays, hardly the stuff of political rebellion. But this was precisely what made them useful. Edwardian society still frowned upon women congregating in public without male escorts. Cafes and taverns were suspect, associated with vice or loose reputations. But tea rooms, they were socially acceptable. They were places where nice women could meet without raising eyebrows. And it was in these genteel surroundings that some of the most radical ideas of the age were exchanged. The Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, often relied on informal networks to organise. Public halls could be monitored, outdoor rallies could be disrupted, but tea rooms provided a quieter, subtler venue. Women activists could meet, plan marches, discuss strategies, and even recruit new supporters under the cover of ordering scones. To passers-by, it looked like gossip. In reality, it was grassroots politics. It wasn't just about secrecy, though. Tea rooms symbolised a new kind of independence. For Edwardian women, the ability to step into a public venue, order tea with their own money, and sit without a male guardian was already an act of autonomy. These spaces gave women control over their time, their conversations, and crucially, their networks. In tea rooms, suffragettes weren't daughters, wives, or sisters under supervision. They were activists, strategists, and comrades in arms. The tea room also helped bridge class divides within the movement. Afternoon tea in London hotels was the preserve of the wealthy, but modest tea shops and chain establishments like Lyons Corner houses welcomed middle and lower middle class women too. Suffragettes came from many walks of life, and tea tables provided neutral ground where a governess, a teacher, and an heiress could sit side by side, united by politics and pastry. This mingling was vital for the movement. It gave the cause a broader base and helped suffragettes present themselves as representing all women, not just the privileged few. There was a tactical advantage as well. Tea rooms were bustling, public places, which made them difficult to infiltrate or disrupt without drawing unwanted attention. Police could hardly storm into a tea shop to arrest women eating sponge cake without looking ridiculous. The suffragettes knew this and used it to their advantage. Their public reputation as ladies at tea worked like camouflage, hiding their activism in plain sight. Humour and theatrics often found their way into these gatherings too. Suffragettes had a knack for blending serious politics with biting wit, and tea rooms gave them plenty of material. They joked about trading recipes for revolution, laughed about handing out votes for women pamphlets with the bill, and used humour to sustain morale in the face of harsh opposition. It was easier to endure hecklers, arrests, and hunger strikes when you shared laughter and sponge with comrades in a tea shop the day before. Not all tea rooms were friendly to the cause. Some establishments barred suffragettes outright, worried that their meetings might scare off genteel clientele, but others leaned into the politics, embracing their role as safe havens for activists. Independent tea shop owners, often women themselves, recognised the importance of providing spaces where women could gather without judgment. These shopkeepers became quiet allies in the struggle, their establishments doubling as headquarters for revolutionary chatter. Newspapers occasionally mocked this connection, portraying suffragettes as frivolous women plotting upheaval over tea and cake. The irony, of course, was that these dismissals only highlighted how subversive the act really was. What could be more threatening to the status quo than women turning the most feminine, safe, and respectable of rituals into a launch pad for demanding political equality? The image of suffragettes sipping tea while planning marches unsettled critics precisely because it showed that rebellion had invaded even the most genteel spaces. Tea itself became a political tool. Suffragette fundraising events often took the form of teas where supporters gathered to donate, socialise and plan. Selling votes for women tea sets and hosting suffrage teas blurred the line between domestic ritual and political activism. Every cup poured became a quiet statement. Women were not content with being silent hostesses. They wanted a voice in the nation's affairs. And while the Edwardian tea table was supposed to symbolise stability, harmony and order, suffragettes used it to push for change. Each polite stir of sugar masked a deeper stirring of society. Each slice of Victoria's sponge was eaten while discussing protests, petitions and hunger strikes. The tea table may have looked serene, but beneath it revolution was simmering. In the end, the suffragettes proved that politics doesn't always happen in Parliament or on the streets. Sometimes it happens in a tea room, over a pot of Darjeeling, with crumbs of sponge cake on the table and ink-stained pamphlets tucked discreetly into handbags. Afternoon tea, once the symbol of Edwardian refinement, became one of the many small but vital stages where women rehearsed their roles in shaping the future. If the Edwardians loved one thing more than leisure, it was advice about their health. The early 20th century was a golden age of wellness, fads, tonics, sea bathing, patent medicines that promised to cure everything from baldness to nervous exhaustion. Into this climate of constant self-diagnosis and cure-all remedies marched tea, wearing the halo of both tradition and modernity. Doctors claimed it soothed nerves, settled digestion, and refreshed weary bodies. In a world where visiting an actual therapist meant embarrassment and expense, your therapist was a teapot and 3 custard creams. Medical professionals, dietitians, and advertisers worked in chorus to pitch tea as a wonder drink. On one hand, it was framed as ancient wisdom, imported from the East, where it had supposedly been consumed for centuries as a tonic. On the other, it was praised as perfectly suited to the modern Edwardian body, overstimulated by industrialization, urban noise, and the strain of keeping up appearances. A cup of tea, doctors insisted, calmed the nerves after the chaos of city streets, and soothed digestion after the heavy dinners of Edwardian excess. Tea's reputation for calming nerves was particularly potent. The Edwardian era was an anxious age beneath its glitter. Electricity buzzed into homes, motor cars rattled through the streets, telephones rang with disembodied voices. For many, the sheer speed of modern life felt overwhelming. Tea offered an antidote, warm, familiar, grounding. Physicians published articles describing tea as a mild stimulant that sharpened the mind without the disruptive effects of alcohol. It was pitched as the civilized choice, a drink that kept you alert but respectable. Unlike gin, tea wouldn't leave you sprawling in the gutter. Unlike coffee, it was less likely to produce nervous irritability, or so the tea advocates argued. Digestion, too, became part of the pitch. Edwardians ate meals that could only be described as heroic in scale. Luncheons of meats and pies, dinners with multiple courses of fish, beef, puddings and cheese. It was little wonder indigestion was practically a national pastime. Doctors claimed tea could cut through the heaviness, aiding digestion and lightening the stomach. Whether this was medically accurate mattered less than the reassurance. After gorging on beef and suet pudding, a cup of Ceylon with lemon gave people the comforting illusion they had balanced out their sins. Tea's mild caffeine content was another selling point. Unlike coffee, which was often associated with jitteriness, tea provided what enthusiasts called a gentle lift. It became a socially acceptable form of energy management, the Edwardian equivalent of a mid-afternoon energy drink. Advertisements leaned into this, promising clarity, vitality, and productivity in every cup. Clerks were told it would help them keep their ledgers straight, students that it would help them concentrate, and housewives that it would give them strength to power through the day. Tea, they insisted, was not indulgence but self-care. The moral undertones of this health craze were impossible to miss. In a society where alcohol was blamed for poverty, crime, and moral decline, tea was presented as its virtuous opposite. Temperance movements actively promoted tea drinking as a healthy alternative to the tavern. Fundraising events for churches or charities often took the form of tea gatherings, explicitly framed as wholesome. The message was clear: good people drank tea, not gin. To offer a guest tea was to offer not just refreshment but moral reassurance. Of course, the commercial world pounced on these medical and moral claims. Tea brands filled newspapers with advertisements extolling their health benefits. Some leaned on pseudo-scientific jargon, promising to stimulate without strain or purify the system. Others paired their products with images of rosy-cheeked children or serene women, suggesting that tea not only calmed adults but also contributed to family health. It wasn't unusual to see adverts claiming that tea cured headaches, revived energy, and improved mood, all for the price of a few pennies a packet. Not everyone agreed. A handful of critics worried that tea drinking was being overdone. Physicians who dislike stimulants warned of tea nerves, a vague condition where too much tea supposedly made people anxious, pale, and excitable. Others argued that tea's reputation for aiding digestion was exaggerated, pointing out that milk, sugar, and pastries consumed alongside it probably didn't help stomachs at all. Yet these voices were drowned out by the overwhelming cultural momentum behind tea. For every doctor warning about tea nerves, 5 more insisted that tea was the key to vigour, calm, and health. For the Edwardian everyman and everywoman, none of this debate really mattered. What mattered was the ritual. Sitting down with a pot of tea after a long day was as close to therapy as most people got. It was cheap, accessible, and instantly comforting. Housewives, weary from household chores, poured tea as an act of self-kindness. Workers drained mugs of strong Assam to banish fatigue. Students preparing for exams swore by its ability to keep their minds alert. Tea didn't just symbolize health, it felt like health in a cup. And so the Edwardians wrapped themselves in the reassuring steam of tea. Whether or not it actually soothed nerves or healed stomachs was irrelevant. What mattered was that it seemed to, and that the culture, doctors, advertisers, temperance leaders told them it did. Tea was not only fashionable, not only delicious, but also medicine in disguise, disguised further as morality. In Edwardian Britain, tea was not just for ladies in grand hotels or clerks in modest parlours, it was for everyone, including children. The nation's youngest were ushered into the tea ritual almost as soon as they could hold a cup. For Edwardian families, nursery teas, schoolroom teas, and even church teas were more than refreshment. They were tools of education, discipline, and moral training. Nothing says childhood like milk, sugar, and a lecture about posture. Nursery teas were a fixture in middle and upper-class households. These daily rituals took place in the late afternoon, usually presided over by a nurse or governess, who ensured that the children practiced both eating and behaving like proper young ladies and gentlemen. The food was simple: bread and butter, jam tarts, sponge cake, and of course milky tea. This wasn't the strong Assam their parents drank. Children's tea was diluted, often more milk and sugar than actual tea leaves. Still, the symbolism mattered. The nursery tea table was a training ground, a miniature rehearsal for the grand tea tables of adulthood. Children learned to sit upright, to hold their cups correctly, to speak politely, and above all, to resist the temptation of gobbling 3 slices of cake before anyone else had a chance. The governess or nurse was more than a caregiver, she was the etiquette coach. She corrected how spoons were held, reminded children to say thank you when offered bread, and scolded them for slouching. These lessons were as much moral as they were social. To drink tea properly was to embody discipline, self-control and refinement, values Edwardian society prized in its future citizens. The nursery table was not just about feeding hungry children, it was about feeding them a steady diet of manners. In schools, tea appeared in equally instructive ways. Boarding schools and day schools often served weak tea at mealtimes, a beverage that was cheaper and more reliable than milk, and far less scandalous than cider or beer, which some children still drank in earlier centuries. At afternoon breaks, students might line up for a mug of tea accompanied by bread, butter or buns. These school teas were less about elegance and more about practicality, providing children with warmth and energy before they returned to lessons or games. Still, the association with tea reinforced the message that even at school they were being inducted into the nation's central ritual. Church and charity teas also catered to children. These events, often organised by Sunday schools or philanthropic groups, introduced working-class children to the gentility of the tea table. For some, it was the first time they encountered sponge cake served on plates or tea poured from a pot, instead of ladled out from a battered kettle. These occasions were intended to be more than treats. They were lessons in respectability. Reformers believed that exposing poor children to the civilizing influence of tea could encourage better manners and healthier habits. A biscuit, a lecture, and a diluted cup of Ceylon could in theory transform the future of Britain, but tea for children was not universally praised. Doctors and health reformers occasionally debated whether caffeine was good for young bodies. Some worried about tea nerves, the idea that children drinking too much strong tea would become restless, pale and irritable. Others argued that milky tea was harmless, even beneficial. It calmed nerves, they insisted, and was far preferable to alcohol, which children in poorer households might otherwise encounter. In Edwardian Britain, where health advice was as plentiful as it was contradictory, tea occupied a safe middle ground. For parents, tea was also a form of control. To invite children to the tea table was to invite them into the rhythms of family life. In middle-class homes, children might join their parents at formal teas on Sundays or special occasions, giving them the chance to display their manners to visiting relatives. These events were high-stakes affairs for young ones who were expected to balance plates, speak when spoken to, and resist fidgeting. Success brought praise, failure brought sighs, scolding, and the certainty that everyone in the room would remember the incident for years. Even the food carried lessons. A slice of plain sponge was considered more appropriate than gorging on eclairs or rich pastries. Simple fare was linked to virtue, indulgence to vice. To be a child at tea was to internalize these coded messages. Moderation meant discipline. Gluttony meant disgrace. Parents and guardians used every crumb to reinforce values. The cake wasn't just dessert, it was a morality play. In working-class families, tea for children looked different but was no less formative. Strong, sweet brews in chipped mugs were common, with bread, dripping, or jam for accompaniment. Here too, tea was about sustenance and comfort, but also about inclusion. A child drinking tea at the family table was part of the adult world, part of the rhythm of the household. Even if there were no lace cloths or porcelain cups, the act of pouring tea bound everyone together. By the Edwardian years, children had become as entwined in the culture of tea as their parents. From nurseries to schools to Sunday socials, tea wasn't just about thirst, it was about training, belonging, and moral formation. It taught them how to behave, how to aspire, and perhaps most importantly, how to sit still long enough for the adults to finish their own tea in peace. For Edwardians, tea was more than a beverage. It was a national identity poured steaming into porcelain. But how did Britain's beloved ritual stack up against the drinking cultures of its neighbours and rivals? While Edwardian Londoners perfected the art of tiered stands and silver trays, the French, Germans and Americans were pursuing their own liquid obsessions, ones that made Britain's tea time look quaint, fussy or downright eccentric. Meanwhile, in America, tea was mostly sweetened leaf-flavoured syrup. Start with France, where the café reigned supreme. If Edwardians gathered at the Ritz for delicate pastries and endless pots of Darjeeling, Parisians parked themselves on rickety cafe chairs facing outward to watch the world go by. The French didn't need cucumber sandwiches. They had strong black coffee served in small cups that could wake the dead. But tea did exist in French society, particularly among the elite, but it lacked the national fervour it carried in Britain. Parisians considered tea somewhat foreign, even fashionable in a slightly exotic sense, but never essential. The French café culture was about conversation, cigarettes, politics, and a little scandal, not whether you put the milk in before or after. If Britain staged tea time like theatre, France turned caffeine into philosophy. Germany offered another contrast. The Edwardians may have measured their afternoons in sips of Darjeeling, but the Germans measured theirs in steins. Beer gardens, not tea rooms, were the heart of German social life. Families and friends gathered outdoors under chestnut trees, drinking frothy lagers and eating pretzels or sausages. It was noisy, communal, and hearty, the polar opposite of the hushed civility of the English tea table. Tea was consumed in Germany, of course, especially in northern regions like East Frisia, where strong brews layered with cream and rock sugar created their own localized rituals. But on the national stage, beer dwarfed tea. To the German eye, Edwardians in lace gloves sipping politely seemed almost alien. Why sit stiffly over a scone when you could belt out a song with a litre of Pilsner? And then there was America, where the story took a sweeter turn. By the Edwardian era, Americans had begun experimenting with iced tea, a concept that baffled many Europeans. Chilling tea and drowning it in sugar seemed eccentric if not barbaric to British eyes. Yet across the Atlantic it caught on quickly, especially after the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, where iced tea was popularized during a blistering heatwave. Americans embraced it with characteristic gusto, adding lemon, mint, and, eventually, industrial amounts of sugar. To Edwardians, this seemed like sacrilege. To Americans, it was progress, a refreshing modern twist on an old beverage. Where the British saw tea as refinement, Americans saw it as something to sweeten, cool down, and gulp. The American preference for coffee also created a divide. While British households carefully rationed tea leaves and performed their 4 o'clock ritual, Americans were throwing pots of coffee on the stove at all hours. Coffee fueled their offices, factories, and politics, while tea was often relegated to the sidelines. When they did drink it hot, it was usually in plain mugs without the theatrics of porcelain cups or etiquette manuals. For Edwardians who believed every detail mattered, the angle of a teaspoon, the placement of a saucer, the American casualness bordered on anarchy. Even beyond Europe and America, Britain's devotion to tea stood out. In Russia, for example, samovars dominated households, producing endless streams of black tea often sweetened with jam. Russians turned tea drinking into a communal, hearty event, one that mirrored but did not match the Edwardian emphasis on refinement. In the Ottoman Empire, tea was gaining popularity, but coffee still held the crown. In Japan and China, tea was bound up in centuries of ritual, philosophy, and aesthetics, practices far older and more sophisticated than Britain's relatively recent obsession. The Edwardians, had they been more self-aware, might have realised their timeless ritual was a very new tradition compared to Asia's millennia of practice. But comparisons didn't stop the British from declaring their way superior. Travel writers of the period often remarked, sometimes smugly, on how foreign cultures failed to use tea properly. They sneered at French cafes for drowning in coffee, laughed at Americans for icing their brews, and marvelled at Germans for sticking with beer. To Edwardians, tea was not just a drink but a sign of national character, calm, orderly, moral, and civil. The fact that it was sweetened by sugar from colonies and imported from thousands of miles away was conveniently ignored. Still, cultural envy and curiosity ran both ways. American magazines occasionally poked fun at Britain's tea mania, mocking the idea of adults arranging their entire afternoons around pastries. French satirists teased English tourists for carrying their tea habits abroad, sometimes demanding kettles and leaves in hotels ill-equipped for such things. Germans occasionally admired British politeness at the table, while happily sticking to their steins. Each nation looked at the other's beverage habits as both amusing and telling, a liquid mirror of cultural values. What made Edwardian tea unique then was not that it was the only ritual involving hot drinks, but that it was elevated into a near-sacred cultural script. No French café had etiquette manuals dictating how to stir sugar. No German beer garden had rules on how to break a pretzel politely. And no American iced tea enthusiast worried about whether a lemon slice should be placed at 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock on the rim of the glass. Britain turned tea into theatre, into morality, into national pride. That was its distinction. In the end, the Edwardians might have chuckled at American syrupy iced tea, rolled their eyes at French philosophers with coffee cups, and gasped at Germans singing in beer gardens, but the differences only highlighted how deeply Britain had fallen under tea's spell. Where other nations treated beverages as fuel, refreshment, or philosophy, the Edwardians made theirs a performance. And perhaps that was the most British thing of all, turning even a humble cup of hot water and leaves into an empire's favourite ritual. For all its polished silver and dainty porcelain, the Edwardian tea table was not always a sanctuary of serenity. Beneath the lace cloths and carefully folded napkins there lurked danger, not of poisoned pastries or collapsing cake stands, but of social scandal. In an era where appearances mattered more than almost anything else, reputations could be brewed and broken as quickly as the tea itself. Your reputation could be ruined faster than cream curdling in hot tea. The Edwardians loved gossip almost as much as they loved scones. Afternoon tea provided the perfect setting, intimate enough for whispers, public enough to spread news, and genteel enough to disguise malicious talk as concern. A misplaced glance, a delayed invitation, or a whispered aside could snowball into a rumour that travelled faster than the 4:10 express to Brighton. Unlike a noisy dinner party or boozy ball, tea gatherings had just the right amount of calm for scandal to be dissected with precision. A cup in one hand, a cucumber sandwich in the other, all the tools one needed to unravel someone else's reputation. Romantic entanglements often provided the juiciest fodder. Affairs between members of high society were practically a sport, but they had to be hidden with extreme care. Tea parties, with their atmosphere of civility, became both cover and catalyst. A lady who lingered too long pouring tea into a gentleman's cup, or a gentleman who accidentally chose the seat beside the same woman week after week, could spark whispers. Sometimes these rumours were baseless, sometimes they were all too true. In both cases, the tea table acted like a magnifying glass, enlarging every tiny gesture until it glowed with suspicion. Newspaper columnists eagerly fed off this. Society pages were filled with tidbits that blurred the line between reporting and entertainment. Who was seen at the Ritz enjoying tea with whom? Who left Claridge's looking flushed after a tete-a-tete over scones? Even when names weren't explicitly printed, readers recognised the veiled hints. To be the subject of such an insinuation could either boost one's social allure or destroy one's standing altogether. Tea tables, in this sense, weren't just social spaces. They were potential stages for exposure with the press waiting in the wings. Etiquette failures also brewed scandal. In a culture obsessed with manners, even minor slip-ups became ammunition. A hostess who served lukewarm tea risked being whispered about for weeks. A guest who devoured too many pastries could be painted as greedy, while one who refused food might be accused of aloofness. Stirring tea too loudly, leaving crumbs on the cloth, or arriving in the wrong outfit might seem trivial today, but in Edwardian society they were treated as indicators of one's breeding. For rivals eager to see a peer stumble, afternoon tea was the perfect hunting ground. Financial scandal also found its way to the tea table. Because so much Edwardian business was conducted in informal settings, tea often provided the backdrop for negotiations and whispered deals. When those deals soured, or when rumours of bankruptcy began to swirl, tea rooms buzzed with speculation. Who had defaulted on debts? Which once proud family was selling off silver to keep appearances? The ritual of abundance, trays groaning with food, cups constantly refilled, only made financial decline more conspicuous. Guests noticed when cakes looked smaller, when the silver had lost its shine, when cheaper blends replaced Darjeeling. In Edwardian Britain, you couldn't hide a dwindling fortune for long. It showed up in the quality of your tea. Even fashion could cause a stir. Hats too wide, gowns too daring, gloves forgotten at home. All could spark commentary sharper than any lemon slice. And because tea was a social space where people sat face to face, every detail was on display. A gown too bold might mark a woman as scandalous. A man arriving without the right tie might seem careless or disrespectful. Gossip spread in minutes, and the tea table gave it fertile ground to grow. Of course, some scandals were deliberately staged. Ambitious hostesses knew that a touch of intrigue kept their gatherings exciting. Inviting a pair of rivals to the same table, or seating a notorious flirt beside a wealthy heiress, could ensure that tongues wagged long after the last cup was drained. In this way, tea tables didn't just host scandal, they manufactured it. The hostess, smiling sweetly as she poured, knew exactly what she was brewing. The irony of it all was that afternoon tea was designed to project civility. It was supposed to be the calm interlude of the day, a pause between luncheon and dinner, a ritual of refinement. Yet in practice, it often became a minefield where reputations were tested, alliances shifted, and gossip brewed thicker than the Assam in the pot. The very setting that seemed so innocent, porcelain cups, sugar tongs, lace napkins, was also one of the most treacherous. So while Edwardians sipped their tea with delicate precision, they also kept their ears pricked for whispers and their eyes trained on who sat where, who said what, and who dared to laugh too loudly. Afternoon tea wasn't only a performance of elegance, it was also an arena of risk. One slip of the tongue, one misplaced look, and a person's name could become fodder for the next morning's chatter. For the Edwardian elite, tea was a double-edged sword. It bound society together with ritual, but it also gave society the perfect weapon for cutting reputations to shreds. To attend tea was to step into a world where every gesture mattered, where sugar wasn't the only thing that could dissolve quickly. If the Edwardian tea table was theatre in real life, it was also endlessly staged on the page and canvas. Writers and artists of the early 20th century could not resist using tea as shorthand for character, class and mood. To read Edwardian novels or gaze at the illustrations of the time is to encounter tea again and again, each cup steeped with social meaning. Half the plots of Edwardian fiction start with someone pouring Earl Grey. Tea was a natural fit for Edwardian literature because it was a universal experience. Nearly everyone, from duchesses to clerks, drank it daily, which made it a perfect literary symbol. A novelist didn't need to describe tea to readers. They already knew its flavours, its rituals, its props. All the author had to do was sketch the setting, a silver pot in a drawing room, or a chipped mug in a boarding house, and the entire social world of the character came alive. Tea was more than refreshment in these stories. It was a cultural marker that told the reader who belonged where in the great Edwardian hierarchy. Take the novels of E.M. Forster. In Howard's End, published in 1910, tea is more than a drink, it's a battlefield of manners. Characters navigate class, family and morality across drawing room tables where the choice of biscuit can carry as much meaning as the choice of words. To refuse tea is to signal rejection. To pour it for someone else is to signal intimacy or authority. Forster knew his readers would catch these nuances instantly because they lived them every day. Afternoon tea became a literary shorthand for entire moral universes. Even lighter Edwardian fiction, the comedies and romances serialized in magazines, leaned heavily on tea as plot device. How else to bring two characters together without raising suspicion? Dinner was too bold, the theatre too expensive, but tea was respectable. Countless fictional heroines met their love interests over teacups, the conversation moving from polite chatter to hints of passion, while the spoon rested delicately on the saucer. Tea tables gave writers the perfect mix of respectability and possibility, a setting where anything might happen beneath the surface of small talk. Children's literature, too, used tea as a marker of order and comfort. While Edwardians inherited Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from the Victorian period, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party continued to loom large in Edwardian imaginations. Its chaos, endless cups, shifting seats, nonsensical rules resonated because it inverted the orderly world of real tea. To Edwardian children, the joke was clear. The Mad Hatter was funny because he broke every rule their governess drilled into them during nursery teas. Writers of the Edwardian age played with this contrast, sprinkling references to tea to either reassure young readers or to poke fun at the seriousness of adult rituals. Art and illustration also brimmed with teacups. Magazine covers from Punch to the Illustrated London News frequently depicted fashionable women in tea gowns or lampooned tea table excess. Cartoons exaggerated wide-brimmed hats colliding over teapots or poked fun at men who pretended to disdain tea but secretly relished it. Artists recognized tea as both symbol and satire, a ritual ripe for visual humor. A drawing of a crowded tea table instantly conjured social pretension, while an image of workers hunched over mugs of strong brew suggested solidarity and endurance. Painters, too, turned to tea as subject matter. Domestic interiors often featured women gathered around tea trays, their faces lit by the afternoon glow filtering through lace curtains. These works reinforced ideals of femininity and home, serenity, refinement, and harmony. Yet the very repetition of the image shows just how central tea had become to cultural imagination. To show a family gathered around a teapot was to affirm the Edwardian belief that tea wasn't just drink, but the glue of daily life. Tea also appeared in advertising art, which blurred the line between commerce and culture. Colourful lithographs displayed idyllic families smiling over cups of branded blends, while posters for Maserati or Lipton employed artistic flourishes to elevate tea into an aesthetic experience. These advertisements were as much part of Edwardian visual culture as fine art. In fact, they reached far larger audiences. For many households, the images of happy families on tea posters became the standard vision of domestic bliss, a cultural myth reinforced every time someone walked into a shop. Even poetry gave tea its moment. While it rarely inspired the grand epics reserved for war or love, poems in magazines and newspapers often used tea as symbol of comfort, civility, or satire. Verses mocked pompous hosts who obsessed over their silver or celebrated the humble pleasure of a strong brew after work. These playful verses reflected tea's unique place in Edwardian life, too common to be solemn, but too essential to ignore. What tied all these depictions together was the assumption that tea mattered. Writers and artists didn't need to explain why. Their audiences already knew. Tea was shorthand for home, class, gossip, morality, and sometimes rebellion. A single cup on a table could evoke an entire world of meaning, from the stability of a happy family to the hypocrisy of polite society. And perhaps that was the ultimate cultural achievement of Edwardian tea. It transcended the table and entered the imagination, becoming a symbol that everyone recognized and understood. Whether it was Foster's drawing rooms, a Punch cartoon, or an advertisement pasted on a shop wall, tea was more than leaves and water. It was identity, performance and culture in liquid form. Every golden age has its twilight, and for Edwardian afternoon tea, the shadows fell swiftly with the outbreak of World War I. The years leading up to 1914 had been the peak of the tea craze, glittering hotel lounges packed with society's elite, department store tea rooms buzzing with middle-class chatter, and silver trays polished to a mirror shine in country houses. But the war broke more than international treaties. It shattered the very foundations of the Edwardian lifestyle. After the war, fewer people cared about perfect scones, and more about not starving. The first blow was practical. Britain's tea obsession depended entirely on steady imports from India, Ceylon, and beyond. Once war erupted, global shipping routes grew perilous. German U-boats stalked supply ships, and convoys diverted resources to food, weapons, and troops. Tea, which had seemed limitless in peacetime, suddenly became vulnerable. Prices rose, availability shrank, and the once reliable ritual began to look like a luxury. For households accustomed to multiple pots a day, the pinch was felt keenly. A weak brew or a smaller pot became the new reality. The empire might still control the plantations, but wartime made it clear. No empire could control the sea. Then came rationing. The government, desperate to stabilize supplies, introduced restrictions that cut deep into Edwardian rituals. Sugar, that essential companion of tea, was among the first casualties. Without it, the nation's beloved drink tasted bitterer, a symbolic reminder of leaner times. Cakes, pastries, and other staples of the tea table were harder to come by as wheat, butter, and cream were redirected or rationed. The multi-tiered stands of sandwiches and sweets became rare sights, replaced by plain bread or whatever substitutions inventive housewives could muster. Afternoon tea, once an arena of abundance, shrank into a stripped-down version of itself. But it wasn't just logistics that killed the craze. War reshaped society's values. The Edwardian world of lavish rituals and unhurried leisure suddenly felt grotesquely out of step with the times. Soldiers in the trenches didn't need cucumber sandwiches. They needed rations that could survive mud, cold, and shellfire. Civilians on the home front, enduring shortages and losses, found little comfort in rituals that once screamed refinement, but now whispered privilege. The glamour of the Ritz tea table looked absurd compared to the sight of families queuing for bread, or women toiling in munitions factories. Hotels and tea rooms, once bustling with chatter and orchestras, grew subdued or closed altogether. Many of their grand lounges were repurposed for wartime needs, hosting meetings, fundraising events, or serving as barracks and hospitals. The spaces that had defined Edwardian tea culture were absorbed into the machinery of survival. Even the wealthiest families scaled back. Afternoon tea still existed, but it was often more symbolic than indulgent. A single pot shared, a few slices of stale bread buttered thinly, all performed with a stoicism that would have made their Edwardian ancestors faint. The psychological shift was just as dramatic. Before the war, tea had been about performance, refinement and status. Afterward, it became about comfort and necessity. People still drank it. In fact, they arguably drank more, since tea remained affordable compared to alcohol and gave a sense of warmth in bleak times. But the sparkle was gone. No one lingered over pastries debating which spoon to use. The war had made etiquette manuals irrelevant. When bombs were falling and telegrams brought news of lost sons, nobody cared if you stirred your tea clockwise or counterclockwise. The class dynamics of tea also shifted. In the Edwardian heyday, the tea table had been a space where class distinctions were performed and reinforced. Silver teapots in Mayfair, enamel mugs in Yorkshire. But during the war, those divisions blurred. Working-class families queued for rations alongside aristocrats. Women of every class volunteered in hospitals or took up work in factories. Soldiers, regardless of background, drank the same brews in battered tin cups. Tea still united Britain, but it did so horizontally rather than hierarchically. The ritual became less about showing status and more about surviving together. When the war finally ended in 1918, the Edwardian world it had shattered never truly returned. The social order had shifted, the economic landscape had changed, and the appetite for ostentatious ritual had dwindled. The 1920s brought new pleasures: jazz, cocktails, cinemas, motorcars. Afternoon tea remained, but it was stripped of the Edwardian grandeur. It became simpler, humbler, a habit rather than a spectacle. Hotels still served it, but without the same cultural dominance. Households still brewed it, but with fewer rules. The golden age of chandeliers, orchestras and towering pastry stands was over. That is not to say tea disappeared, far from it. The British continued to drink it with near-religious devotion, but its role had changed. Where once it had symbolised refinement and empire, it now symbolised resilience and comfort. Wartime had transformed tea from a glamorous social stage into a national survival tool. The Edwardian craze had been a glittering bubble, and the war popped it, leaving behind a more practical, pared-down ritual. The slow decline of Edwardian tea was less about abandonment than adaptation. Society didn't reject tea, it redefined it. Gone was the gilt-edged fantasy, replaced by the sturdy mug and the communal pot. Afternoon tea no longer dictated social life, but it remained its quiet anchor, and perhaps that was the ultimate irony. Stripped of its pretensions, tea emerged not weaker but stronger, embedded more deeply than ever in the fabric of daily life. Though the chandeliers have dimmed and the orchestras have long since packed up, the Edwardian afternoon tea never really disappeared. It transformed, evolved and adapted to the rhythms of modern life, leaving behind a legacy that still shapes how we think about tea today. Walk into the Ritz, Claridge's or any hotel offering traditional afternoon tea, and you are stepping directly into Edwardian nostalgia, even if the waiters now carry credit card machines instead of silver sugar tongs. Edwardians perfected afternoon tea. We perfected the selfie with it. One of the clearest survivals is the ritual of hotel teas. While their Edwardian ancestors might have been grander affairs, the essential elements remain: tiered stands loaded with sandwiches, scones with clotted cream and jam, and rows of pastries designed to dazzle as much as to nourish. The theatre of the tea table lives on, the crisp white linen, the polished cutlery, the sense that this is more than a snack. Guests today book tables months in advance, often less for hunger than for experience. Afternoon tea has become an event, a performance that connects the present to the Edwardian past. Etiquette too has left its fingerprints. While most people no longer worry about whether to stir their tea clockwise or counterclockwise, echoes of Edwardian precision linger. Guides to proper afternoon tea still circulate, reminding modern tea-goers to pinch the handle delicately, to never clink spoons against porcelain, and to spread jam before cream, or vice versa if you want to ignite a Devon-Cornwall argument. Even if today's diners are less rigid, the fascination with doing it right speaks to the Edwardian obsession with turning tea into art. The difference is that now the rules are less about survival in polite society and more about recreating the charm of a lost age. The foods that defined Edwardian tea have also endured. Scones remain the centrepiece, their fate still contested between Devon and Cornwall. Finger sandwiches, once mocked for their daintiness, are now celebrated for their elegance. Pastries have grown more elaborate, leaning into modern patisserie trends, but their roots remain the same: small, pretty, and designed to impress. Even the humble teapot, whether silver or ceramic, still sits at the centre of tables across Britain and beyond. The Edwardian menu survives not because it was practical, but because it was delightful, and delight has never gone out of fashion. What's new is the audience. Edwardian teas were exclusive, reserved for the wealthy or those aspiring to join them. Today, afternoon tea is marketed to tourists, couples, families, and anyone looking for an indulgence. It has gone from social necessity to leisure treat, from symbol of class to symbol of experience. The Edwardian lady might have worried about being judged for choosing the wrong pastry. The modern visitor worries only about getting the perfect photo for Instagram. In this way, the Edwardian tea table has found new life, not in gossip columns but in hashtags. Globally, the Edwardian tea legacy has spread far beyond Britain. Hotels in New York, Tokyo, and Dubai all boast traditional English afternoon tea, complete with tiered trays and clotted cream flown in from Cornwall. What began as a specifically British obsession has become a worldwide performance. The irony is that most modern participants have little idea how recent and theatrical the Edwardian ritual really was. They see it as timeless, unaware that its golden age barely lasted 2 decades before the war forced it to shrink. In truth, they're reenacting Edwardian fantasy more than historical continuity, but that fantasy remains irresistible. At the same time, modern tea culture has democratized. Where Edwardians insisted on porcelain cups and lace napkins, today many people enjoy tea in mugs at desks, sofas, or bus stops. The ritual of 4 o'clock is no longer binding, but the comfort of tea remains. The Edwardians may have elevated tea into theatre, but the everyday British brew, milk, sugar, and a sturdy mug is the true heir of the empire's obsession. Afternoon tea may now be a special occasion rather than a daily practice, but it remains a touchstone of Britishness, recognisable across generations. The cultural imagination hasn't let go either. Novels, films, and television dramas still lean on afternoon tea as a visual shortcut for elegance. From Downton Abbey to endless costume dramas, the tea table remains shorthand for Edwardian grace and refinement, a symbol instantly understood. The fact that audiences recognise the ritual so easily is testament to how deeply the Edwardians imprinted it on the world. In the end, the legacy of Edwardian tea is a blend, part tradition, part invention, part nostalgia. It lives on in the grand hotels of London, in the etiquette guides recycled for modern audiences, in the endless debates about cream and jam, and in the tourist snapshots posted online. It is less a daily ritual now, and more a cultural performance, a way to step briefly into the elegance of a vanished world. The Edwardians may have built their tea tables as stages for gossip and status, but they also built something enduring. Over a century later, we are still raising cups to their creation, sometimes earnestly, sometimes ironically, but always with a sense that this ritual matters.